Good morning, everyone. Please take your seats. My name is Clemens Grünbühl. I am still a newbie, but I joined SEI a bit over 6 months ago as the policy coordinator of the Asia office. And hope you all survived last night. And I want to get right into it. This session was originally about whether working together was a pleasure or a curse. A pleasure or a challenge, sorry. But then I went through the abstracts and thought, well, actually, a bridge between all the abstracts is something that we're struggling with at SEI in general, which is co-production of knowledge. I think the last 2 days have shown that producing knowledge for policy is a challenge for us all. We haven't quite figured it out, even though, of course, externally we claim we did. And especially working with other systems of knowledge remains a challenge. I think we've heard comments like, well, what if the policymakers don't believe in science and things like that? I think we have to acknowledge, and that's been shown by other presentations already, that scientific knowledge is definitely not the only system or form of knowledge that policymakers adhere to. All right? We have to also find ways to work with other groups, to work with other systems of knowledge, to co-produce new forms of knowledge that are relevant to policymakers, relevant to society in general. So in order to tackle these questions, we have a stellar lineup looking at co-production of knowledge and how our scientific knowledge can be more effectively used in the policy development process. The way we'll do it is that we'll have 4 presentations, each 10 minutes. We'll allow for questions, not comments about your great other research projects that you've been doing so far, but questions referring to the presentation itself. And then after we've completed 4 of the presentations, we'll have a moderated discussion on what your perspective is. That's when you can come up with your great science that you've been doing, your perspective on co-production of knowledge and how to effectively use scientific knowledge in policy development for the last half hour. All right, so that's the plan, and with no further ado, I'll ask Liz to mount the stage.
Is that better? No. I don't think that, oh, there we go. Okay, perfect, thank you. Great, thanks very much, everyone. My name's Liz. I'm working at the Oxford Centre. I'm going to quickly just touch on the relevance and the importance of knowledge co-production in the field of climate services, and some work that we've been doing in the Climate Services Initiative around the improved design, or rather co-design of climate services. So for those who might be unfamiliar with climate services is essentially climate information that, oh, sorry, there's a bit of feedback there. Climate information that can be used to assist and support decision making, so it can actually be used in decision making processes. So, for example, it might be daily or seasonal forecasts that that a farmer would be able to use to therefore plan when to plant crops. If you plant just before heavy rain, the likeliness is you might lose a lot of your seeds, the topsoil will be washed away, you might lose your harvest. The implications are very great. taking in an urban context, if you're an urban planner, we're working in Southern Africa, an urban planner in Lusaka. You need to be factoring in to think about what size capacity drainage channels might be needed to withstand future flood risk in the next 30, 40 years. So being able to use and consider that climate information in making those decisions is critical. So let's, for a moment, just put ourselves into the position. So I've just been talking about a city planner in Lusaka. So we're working at the moment on a project in Southern Africa, in cities in Lusaka, in Windhoek, and a number of other cities in Southern Africa. And you're aware that you need to factor in climate information. But what you get is this information. So this might be something that's provided by a climate scientist. Now, question to the floor really, who would feel comfortable or confident in being able to make decisions based on this information in its current format? Probably very few of us. So if we are not coming from a meteorology, climate science background, this information can sometimes be quite overwhelming. And so often what we're finding when we have these initial conversations with city planners, they're saying, well, I might use this information in a report. Great, I'll put it in my report, fantastic. But am I actually using it to factor into the decisions I make? So when I'm thinking about what size capacity drainage channel might be needed, when I'm thinking about how do I appraise and understand what water supply options are critical for the city, how can I use this information? And this is really summing up a broader issue in climate services, that the information and answers that are available are very different from the questions that are being asked by users, by the decision makers who are trying to plan for future climate risk. And this is sometimes called the usability gap. There's this quite huge gap between the information that's provided from climate science and the information that's being requested from the decision makers on the ground. And so this comes to really sort of the core of how do we bridge this gap and what can we do about this? And this is where co-production really is critical. So it's not just around the tailoring of this information into better formats, but it's more really around bringing in these different knowledge bases, different perspectives and different priorities. So not only scientific knowledge, but also very much local knowledge, understanding decision contexts that decision makers on the ground and policymakers are facing. So that's all well and good in practice. So we talk about co-production, this is great, but I just want to share very quickly some reflections from this project that we're working on in Southern Africa. I've highlighted a few here, which I just want to flag out. So can we really co-produce? I'm still not totally sure how to integrate climate information into this process in a really useful way. Communication can be challenging, co-production is challenging. Interestingly, maybe we can co-produce technically, but not politically. And these are all reflections from very recently from a project that we're working on in Southern Africa. And we see that it's a wonderful aspiration, but how do we actually really do this? And so this has led us to developing a framework that we are going to be testing and trialing, which we want to use to try and give more structure to the co-production process. So it gives more transparency and helps to provide climate service providers, so meteorologists and climate scientists, but also intermediaries such as ourselves, knowledge brokers who are really trying to translate the information that's coming from climate science to the decision makers, but also translating from decision makers what their needs really are, what decisions are they making, what are the institutions that they're working within, and translating that back to climate scientists and having that ongoing communication. So I'm not going to talk through this in great detail, but this is the outline of a framework that we've been developing. And within this, so we see three key stages around engaging and scoping, co-exploration and co-production, and then hopefully the uptake and use of a climate service. And within that, we have key steps. I won't talk through that in great detail. I'm sure that some of that might come out in the discussion later. But this is really something that we want to use to be able to frame the co-production process. And so very much early on, engaging and scoping, it's critical that we really understand, well, what are the challenges that decision makers are facing, and really understanding who the users are. So which decision makers are really taking those critical decisions, who is important to be factoring in climate information, but also which senior decision makers also will be sort of signing off on major policies. And then moving into the co-exploration and co-production phase. So from the engaging and scoping phase, there's a really clear idea of which actors need to be engaged, who are the critical actors to really bring into this co-production phase. And then the co-production phase itself is the most critical part. So really understanding what decisions are being made and by who. So this might be, in the city planner example, understanding if it's really around the capacity of drainage channels. Are there other options that are being appraised? And what's the institutional context? And so we also have these 4 cross-cutting themes that we think are critical, that would really drive the uptake of climate services, and that they need to be factored throughout the process. So this is really around understanding and having conversations around what financing model would be needed for a climate service, and that might be around the development of public-private partnerships, for example. And the communication of climate information, so the way that information is communicated and co-produced together will really drive the way that information can be taken up and used. And very important, capacity and partnership development. So through this co-production process, we really see that capacity can be built. So this project that we're working in Southern Africa, it's very much around engaging in learning labs, open spaces where we can really discuss and share information in a collaborative environment, and through that process really building capacity. And then critically, which has been an area that's been very overlooked in climate services, is around the monitoring and evaluation, and then the really important part, the learning from that. And so understanding the effectiveness of how climate information can be used in decision making, and then reflecting on that, and how can a climate service then be refined and improved, that this is not just limited to a project, but how do we ensure that this is sustainable in the longer term and is something that is embedded within the institutions. So really understanding that decision and institutional context is critical, and then ensuring that that can therefore be embedded within those institutions. I'm probably going to be running out of time, so I realize I'll stop there. I'm trying to keep this very high level, but this is a framework that is in development at the moment, and we're testing it in a variety of contexts to see how this holds up, how we can refine it. We intend it to be dynamic and evolving, and so taking on the lessons from different contexts. So we've been working very much in a city context in Southern Africa, but we also plan to be testing in Bali with some of Albert and Natalia's work with the farmer field schools. So understanding if this model also really works in a rural agricultural context, and also hopefully in Colombia as well, in the coffee sector, and understanding how much of the information that's produced by the National Meteorological Office, how can the coffee sector better take some of the information that's being used there, but actually make it meaningful, relevant, and usable for farmers in the coffee sector. So I will stop there in the interest of time, but I'm sure there's plenty more we can discuss.
Many thanks, Liz. Quick questions to Liz? Please, Johan.
Just wondering, is just the amount of time you have to spend with a person, getting to know them, that long-term engagement. So how do you I mean, it's difficult, but how do you factor that in? And in your projects, how long will they last for? I mean, have you got any plans to try and stay in touch with the city authorities in Lusaka over the long term? Because to me, that it doesn't happen straight away necessarily. It's when you get to know them.
Yeah. No, I completely agree, and I think that's a challenge. It's a very time-intensive process. It's around building trust, building relationships, and that's something that we've been doing in this project. So this is a 4-year project, and I think it does need that time. And even as we see, so those reflections, that's from 2 years into this project. There's still a lot of challenges. It does take time, and it is resource-intensive. But I do think that it does lead to more sustainable outcomes, and I think it is critical. But this is why we wanted to be thinking about how can we pull the lessons that we're learning from this into this framework. And I think it'll be touched on a little bit later, but how can we also make this framework as usable as possible? So, okay, this is great to understand what that process is, but how can we use that? So I think my colleagues are going to be talking a little bit about how we can use this on the online learning platform of WeAdapt to better direct those working in co-exploration and co-production to key resources, and being able to build and capitalize on those lessons that we've drawn from this project.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Holger Hoff. You used the term institutional context. Could you say a few words on what that could be from your experience, maybe in the cities project or elsewhere? And also if this rather old term of mainstreaming still applies, where you look for opportunities to feed information into ongoing processes. Is that all part of this framework?
Yep, very much. So one of the key steps, and I didn't want to put everything up on here and sort of overload everyone, but one of the key steps is really around understanding that institutional context, which institutions are making which decisions, which institutions have access to data, how are those institutions really working together, or are they not working together, and finding what we're terming windows of opportunity. And so, for example, in Lusaka recently, there's been a water security initiative that has been set up, which is seeking to create a platform between a lot of the institutions that are grappling with some of these issues and making long-term decisions that need to factor in climate risk. And so finding those sorts of opportunities, seeing where those platforms exist and building on those existing platforms, as opposed to sort of coming in much more sort of top down, which has historically been the case, and sort of without really understanding what's already happening and what are those sort of new initiatives that can be built upon that will ensure that a climate service can be embedded, so where we can build on something that's already existing.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz. That was great. Best presentation today so far. And next up we have Sukaina talking about sharing of online knowledge, or online knowledge sharing.
Thank you. Is this working, I guess? All right.
Yes.
Okay, thanks so much, Liz. So that's a great introduction, I think, to the next part of this series of talks, because I think the learning aspect that Liz mentioned here is so critical to everything we do. So some of the work that Liz described is actually what we work on in the Oxford Centre. A lot of our work is around climate services and adaptation planning and supporting adaptation decision making. But I think what we all have in common is that obviously over the last few years we've all been trying to do much more work around the monitoring, evaluation and learning about the effectiveness of what we're doing. And there's momentum to do this obviously in the context of international efforts, frameworks and agreements in the last few years. But I think there's also a great recognition that, all of this work is really happening in silos often, and there's lots of unlinked and separate activities that may be quite good in what they're doing, but they're not exchanging information and learning from each other. And so there's this big gap between science and action that we still see. So some of the things that Liz described in terms of our work in Southern Africa and the principles we've learned over the years in terms of supporting adaptation decision making, good principles around that, that we've learned about, that have been in the IPCC working reports, that are in the Global Framework of Climate Services, they're actually all things that we can aim to translate to the online knowledge brokering space, as well as the offline knowledge brokering space. So a lot of the work that we do is around creating an online space that can support what we're doing face-to-face with partners. So a lot of the stuff that is written about in recent times on those issues is about knowledge co-production, about linking diverse knowledge systems, about having equity in decision-making, including different actors, including hard-to-reach actors, learning together and, co-producing and co-generating the knowledge that's needed for decision-making, but also importantly, co-exploring what the needs are of the users in the climate information, for example, that Liz described. So what does the urban planner need in terms of climate information for their decision? That may not be that clear to intermediaries like us going in to talk to partners. So these are some of the diverse contexts that we've worked in addition to the Southern African context. And I just want to ask the people here, who knows WeAdapt, the online knowledge sharing platform for climate adaptation? Great. How many people here work on climate adaptation? And how many people work on adaptation and use WeAdapt? Oh, sorry, my question is how many people work on adaptation and don't use WeAdapt? So, all of you guys, Julia, take note. We're going to be coming to you after the session to talk to you about what you do in your work and what you need in terms of information, and maybe why you don't use the platform. There may be good reasons for not using the platform, but we're interested in those kind of questions. So in terms of our knowledge brokering, that's a lot of what we do. We're constantly trying to understand what people do, why they do it, what information they need, and whether we can tailor some of what we're doing to try and address those needs. So this is actually a representation of some of the people in SCI who do use WeAdapt. This is not all of them, so it's quite good. But in a nutshell, really what we've learned is that people who want to use an online knowledge sharing platform, which is really about learning about adaptation, learning about good practice, sharing information and connecting people. In a nutshell, what people want is they want high quality information quickly, they want access to networks that they don't necessarily already know quickly, and they want access to content in usable formats that they can easily use. Contributors to the site want high visibility for their content in as little time as possible. So they don't want to invest a lot of time in doing that. So the three areas of work, I was really struggling to figure out what I could say in this talk in the time that we have. So I'm just going to run very quickly through some examples of what we do, and hopefully, we can talk more about it in the coffee break. But if there are three real key areas that, from a high level, we work on. So there's a big aspect of understanding what the needs of users are. There's the big aspect of trying to move from this learning to action, so trying to narrow this science action gap. And then there's a big area of work around, once we have all this information in one space, what can we do with that to then sort of feed back to the original face-to-face work that we do around adaptation, so we can learn some really good stuff about what's going on, and we can compare a lot of the work globally that's going on, but we can feed some of that stuff back into our actual practice on the ground. So we do that in user labs, as Liz said. We do that in workshops. We bring climate scientists and decision makers together to do that quite regularly. But we can also do this by just looking at data. So if, for example, we look at how many of our pages are most visited on the platform, you can't read this, but a quick look at some of our most visited pages shows us that some of the content around conceptual framing of adaptation concepts and vulnerability concepts are the most visited pages, which I wouldn't really have expected, actually, and this is quite a surprise to me. So our page on vulnerability definitions, for example, is the most highly visited page ever on the site over 10 years. And similarly, there's a page on adaptation concepts versus coping mechanisms and definitions of adaptive capacity. Those are the pages that are most highly visited. There are other pages too around, vulnerability assessments and the role of communities in disaster risk mitigation and so on. But some of those things are quite surprising. And so they help us redefine how we present information on the platform. So we might redesign some of our thematic pages to cover more of these conceptual issues, for example. obviously we're always a bit paranoid about, is anyone actually reading our stuff? And the World Bank did a report recently, well, a few years ago now, and they kind of realized that nearly 1/3 of all their PDF reports were never downloaded, not even once. 40% of their content was downloaded fewer than 100 times, and only 13% of their content was downloaded more than 250 times. So that's kind of something that, you know, we have to address as well. So one of the things we do is we're always tweaking what we do, and we're tweaking the platform all the time to try and address these kind of concerns. So for example, John Ensor from our York Centre uploaded some content last year, and we now show how many times content is downloaded as one indicator of the kind of visibility it's getting. This is something that donors are interested in, and it's obviously something that is one indicator of, a shallow indicator of impact, let's say. But we're also interested in what channels people want information in, and how they prefer to receive it and how they prefer to share it. So in terms of social media, who here uses Facebook? Who uses Twitter? What about LinkedIn? Instagram? Snapchat? Okay, so we have, and who uses no social media at all? Okay, so that's quite a diverse range of mediums that people want to send and receive information, and we have to take that into account, obviously. But even for the people who refuse to go on social media, we still catch them because we send out a newsletter. So we assume it's still reading email. So, you know, we're kind of trying to create accessibility for people through many different mediums, because we know that the thing is that today there's a lot more technology that we can use to help further our adaptation, research and practice in a way that there wasn't before. And even if, you know, social media channels or this kind of sharing information on online platforms isn't for you, there is a lot of value that can be gained by getting access to standardized information. So how do we move to action? So there's a lot of work we do around user surveys and workshops and creating personas for our planned decision support tools. So Liz talked a little bit about decision support tools that we develop in our adaptation research as well. So we create mock-up wireframes, for example, to test if what people say they want is actually what they need and is actually what they're requesting, like in reality. So this is an example of a platform that we are working on at the moment to create connection and collaboration between a diverse range of stakeholders. So a project that's looking at linking adaptation stakeholders with disaster risk reduction, the disaster risk reduction research domain and practitioner domain. And, you know, the whole thing about understanding user needs is really about getting into the world of the user. I'm an anthropologist by training, so for me it's really about getting into their worldview and understanding what they want, what they need, why they need it, and maybe creating incentives that address the concerns that they have for not using something that could help them further what they're trying to achieve. So in this case, we're working with the climate adaptation platform, Climate Adapt. So getting into the worldview of a farmer in Southern Africa and the fisherman in the Mekong is, you know, it's no different. You have to get into the world of the Climate Adapt Knowledge Manager. And incentivizing them to want to collaborate on a platform like this is all about understanding what their agenda is and what their priorities are. So I'm just going to run this through quite quickly because there's another example. So the pleasure of working in these kind of collaborations is that you can move from something that's quite complex, like a scientific framework that Liz described, to something that's going to be more accessible to users. So something that's pretty, clickable, interactive, and eventually, you know, something that can go onto a tool that can be used by a lot of people. And if it's used by a lot of people, it can generate new case studies that we can then learn from and will contribute to this meta-analysis that I'll come to in a second. But obviously, this comes with a lot of pain as well. So, you know, you have lots and lots of iterations with developers and designers about what that could look like. Liz mentioned that the integration of climate data with our adaptation work is obviously quite critical. And so there's a lot of work that goes on to try and address that and build capacity around how that climate information could be used. So the knowledge brokering work we do online is a lot about creating that kind of guidance and different user journeys through those tools. So, you know, what a local NGO might need in terms of using these tools that integrate climate information into decision making would be different to what somebody from a development bank might need, and it would be different from what international development organizations would be asking for as well. So we do a lot of that stuff. But then technology provides new avenues for sharing information like we just described. So in Southern Africa, we're developing an adaptation inspiration book, which is showing the cities that we're working with in Southern Africa, which other cities could be inspiring cases to learn from. And with that, it was interesting to see that the SDGs, in the SDG interaction tool, for example, that was used as an indicator for classifying how different, in this case, it's been used to classify, the SDGs have been used to classify how different cases can be accessed. So, but in Southern Africa, access to these kind of tools would be limited to, online accessibility might be quite limited, but most people have a mobile phone and most people have WhatsApp. So some of these snippets of training that we're developing based on this inspiration book are going to be shared on WhatsApp to try and hook people in to the training and then try and get people on board that way. So that's quite an innovative experimental approach that we're not sure if that's going to work. So I'm nearly at the end. So I just want to say that some of you have seen this before. I think I've presented it last year at the Science Forum 2 years ago. And this is all about the meta-analysis side of this data. So if we're collecting all this information and we're trying to standardize the way that people share their adaptation research and practice, there is a lot we can do with that. So this is, I know that's not a simple diagram, but it is a simple representation of more complex data. So here we have a set of organizations who are contributing content to the WeAdapt platform, and we have keywords that they're using to describe their content. And here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we can see which organizations are contributing the most on what topics. And that's interesting because we can see that there are gaps in what kind of adaptation research is being shared, for example. But there are limitations to this, and the limitations are that the language used to describe case studies is not, there isn't a standardized language that is available at the moment on adaptation, on disaster risk, on climate services, on monitoring and evaluation, and so on. And so some of our work is now moving towards that direction to try and develop these taxonomies or languages that we can use to describe the data better. And if we can do that, we can help people to better connect the case studies and the learning that they are doing and share that with partners in the work that we're doing. So that's all I want to say. And I think that will lead into Julia's talk, which will go into more detail about the language.
All right.
And who has questions for Sukaina? Yes, please. Just yell.
I can hear you.
Okay. So does how have you got?
So we're doing that in our project in Southern Africa. So it's a combined group of city stakeholders that we're working with and embedded researchers in the city.
So is it something is that the idea?
At the moment, it's actually, it's something that we're just trying out. So we're trying it with our city partners and with the stakeholders we work with. And at the moment it's quite a closed group. So we're just trying to broadcast messages about the training to this particular curated group and then see what happens with that. I mean, the thing is that the nice thing about that is if they come online to the online training, then there's a lot of dialogue and interaction that the platform will be supporting around that learning. So they'll be able to post questions and the way you would on any other online training course, but hopefully in a more interactive way.
Can I
Please.
just thanks ask about the WhatsApp groups? Is there a way to expand those to reach more people? I never really understand how it works with WhatsApp.
Potentially there could be, I suppose, but in this case we're just experimenting at the moment, so we're just trying it in this particular project.
Okay, cool.
All right, many thanks, Sukaina. Excellent presentation. Next up is Julia talking about fragmented knowledge and how to overcome that.
Okay, thanks, Clemens. Can everyone hear me? Great. Okay, so my presentation is not so much directly on co-producing knowledge, but on helping people understand how knowledge and language is used and how to find the knowledge that they need, which can help support collaboration and co-production. So the sheer volume and richness of information and knowledge about sustainable developments and related issues available today is astounding. But it's really only useful if people can find the knowledge that they need and if they can find that when they need it. There's a lot of talk about knowledge gaps, and these gaps don't always represent a lack of knowledge, but a lack of the ability to find the knowledge that you need in the time constraints and the resource constraints that you are under stress from. And this is currently inhibited by the fact that knowledge languages across a multitude of online platforms and websites, so it's on government ministry websites, on organizational websites, and basically it's fragmented. And this means that trying to find things can be very time intensive. And this is further complicated by a varied understanding of what different terms are used and what they mean. So in sustainable development, language evolves all the time, new terms are coming up all the time, and this can create a minefield for non-experts trying to find the latest relevant information. But there is a way forward, and this is something where we as subject experts, however non-techie, can still have a really important role to play. And this is through the development of kind of subject-specific taxonomies and so-called knowledge modeling, which can help to link up relevant information and make it more discoverable. So taxonomy and semantic tagging, I know these sound really odd terms to many of us. Maybe there's a few that they don't. But in fact, many of us encounter them online every day. To use slightly sexier terms, they provide the digital infrastructure and the information architecture behind a lot of the websites that we use all the time. So they're there in the background, providing the structure to all the content that you're interacting with. So taxonomy is essentially a structured set of terms. So we often see them used for the categorization of content, but they can also be used to describe entire subject areas. So this is part of the climate tagger. I've just expanded some of the climate adaptation branches. If you disagree with anything up there, don't worry. That's something we're working on. But just through visualizing kind of these subject areas in this way, it can be valuable for helping users and especially non-experts to really have an overview of an entire subject area with all the topics and subtopics it contains. But the real application of taxonomies with regards to connecting knowledge online is that these terms can be used for tagging content to make it more searchable both within and across websites. So whereas shared taxonomy or set of terms like this is used to tag all the content that's relevant to one subject area, this can actually mean that all those bits of content can be pulled from across these platforms and websites, from across the web, into one space. So this is really expediting knowledge finding. And so this is the idea of linked open data, and it's something we're trying to use in the Placard project. And we're trying to use it to promote collaboration and co-production between the climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction communities. So this is a mock-up. You might have seen this from the last presentation. So this is the Placard Connectivity Hub that we're developing in SEI Oxford, but with collaborators in Oregon and other partners within Placard, which is a European project. And it uses harmonized climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction taxonomies, these structured sets of terms, to pull knowledge from key adaptation and disaster risk reduction platforms into one space. And it allows them to be browsed in a really highly visual way. So while allowing the searching of multiple platforms through one interface, the idea is that the hub will actually also help reduce the siloing of these communities. So doing this by displaying often overlapping and complementary knowledge side by side, through using this tagging, these terms and keyword tags, to bring together the relevant knowledge from both sides of the divide. So we're also using the hub to help. Oh, yes, sorry, I forgot I had that one. So one of the issues within disaster risk reduction and adaptation is they don't always talk to each other, often because they're using different terms to mean, sorry, the same term to mean different things. So protection is an example of this, and disaster risk reduction, that often talks about civil protection, whereas in adaptation we might think about landscape protection or ecosystems protection. So we're also using the hub to enhance communication between these two communities and to provide some clarity to non-expert audiences. So taxonomies can support this because they contain a lot of metadata, including not just your broader and narrower terms that you saw in that hierarchical structure, but also synonyms, which can be different spellings, different languages, as your alternative labels, related terms. So you might link nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation, depending on how you feel about that. And additional information such as definitions. And we can make this accessible to users to really support their understanding of terms and how these are used by the two communities. And this is something that's really come up in some workshops we've done. So another thing that we've really encountered as an issue is that online searches for content typically rely on keywords to deliver content to you, and we've already experienced this. And although standard tagging go a long way to supporting these knowledge searches by pulling all this content based on these specific terms, it's often the case that if your specific keyword is included, that content doesn't pop up. And that makes it particularly difficult if you want to find something when you're not a content expert. For example, a city planner, as Liz was talking about, they might want to find information on climate-compatible development solutions for their city. And they might search for something like green infrastructure and get great results. But unless they know about things like nature-based solutions, which also might be relevant to their decision context, if they don't search for that term specifically, it won't come up in the searches. And in their haste to report back, they might entirely miss out on this important knowledge for their city. So this brings in the idea of semantic tagging. And this uses an additional layer of information about the relationships between terms within the taxonomy. And this is done through knowledge graphs. So I've got a really simple one here. There we go. This just shows that, Latvia is a country. It's in Europe. This is all basic stuff that we know. But to be able to support this within applications online to help people find this information, we need to put it in a format that allows the machines to know this as well. So adding in this information about relationships between terms, semantic tagging allows implicitly relevant content to be suggested based on those terms in that search as well. So if we search for urban adaptation, we might also get urbanization, urban ecosystems, the urban heat island effect. So this is helping those decision makers who might have had quite a narrow search kind of suddenly become aware of all these emerging areas that are going to be relevant to their decisions. So it helps them explore and discover things that they've not previously considered or known about. As Liz and Sakona both mentioned, we're going to be making use of that in an interactive support tool for climate services. And I'll let you ask us more questions about that. But I'll just quickly say this is something we're doing in collaboration with Pool Party, which is run by the Semantic Web Company, and with developers of the Climate Tagger, which we already use in WeAdapt, and I showed you the example of earlier, but we're hoping to develop this and make it much more powerful for use by all of these different communities. However, obviously, if we want to see this taxonomy system used and adopted widely, we need to make sure we get buy-in from all the user communities and key knowledge platforms. So I'm glad to say that we already have working relationships with some of the key platforms in Europe. So we'll be doing this taxonomy development through very much a kind of consultation basis. It will be a very iterative process. So while the initial work comes from kind of text mining and other things that sound really rather boring, there'll be a lot of iterative cycles. And the actual applications themselves will have functionality that allows people to feed back on those terms and the structures, because there's still disagreement within the communities and we want to allow those discussions to continue. And I think I will stop there before I bore anyone else who might not be thinking on these terms. But if anyone is interested, we did recently put out a brief about this, and it is on the SEI website. And obviously, you can come find me and chat to me as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Please download the brief. Questions for Julia? Yes, please. Behind you, next to you.
Thank you, Julia. That was very interesting. Is this more like this semantic tagging emerges from the way people interact with the information, or do you have to, as a group of experts, define this semantic tagging structure?
So we do have to define it, and this is where we really need to work with content experts.
So is that sort of like more like Expedia? I mean, the Microsoft encyclopedia versus Wikipedia, that there was a group of experts who tried to define what that was, and is there not an alternative that could emerge from the way people interact with the information?
So you're talking in terms of having a system learn?
Yeah.
So there are applications that are starting to learn. I mean, we see this through the Cambridge Analytica and other things like that. I can't comment on that directly. What we will be doing is working directly with stakeholders, because I think there is an argument that it depends on who's using the system, and then that might quickly get biased in a certain way. So we're trying to keep things very, very standardized and very much kind of accepted by the whole community, or at least as far as possible. So kind of working with specific experts rather than having kind of a learning system.
Okay,
but
thank
Pool
you.
Party, I don't think actually provides that service yet either.
There was one question in the back here, and then Nella.
Thanks very much. Neil Hadaway from the Stockholm Centre. That was really interesting. It resonates a lot with what Biljana and I do when we're doing systematic reviews and we search a number of bibliographic databases. And this kind of semantic synonym thesaurus, I guess, would be really useful for us, because we currently do that manually, building up sets of hundreds and hundreds of search terms. I was wondering whether you have any connection with the kind of resources that we as academics often use to search, like Web of Science or Scopus or Google Scholar, to build those kind of systems into those platforms rather than, I guess I'm not quite sure how those would connect.
So I'm building that kind of the search capacity, the SEOs that they work on within those websites.
Yeah. I think this is really, really useful.
Yeah.
It's great for searching within the resources that you have, but we're always talking about needing semantics, and they're very expensive to build. So
I think the idea behind this, and we're trying to work with all the different partners, is that the more the climate tagger, which we're hoping to feed into, actually gets taken up by different kind of people managing platforms, that will start to enable that. So it depends if those people running like Scopus and that, if they would take our more detailed taxonomy on, say, climate change adaptation, and they include that into theirs, then you would see that happening. So it's more of an adoption, I think.
Well, yeah, it's working. Because they're commercial entities, they're always trying to sell their product. So I think you could probably potentially make money on this. They're trying to benefit from that. So I recommend reaching out.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. We'll think on that a lot more, I think.
Hi, Julia. This was really interesting, and I think that my question is related to what Neil just asked. So Neil is asking from the academics' perspective, and my question is very similar, but from the practitioners. So how do you envision this? Like I, for example, as an NGO person working on a specific project on, I don't know, a climate change adaptation from glacier retreat. How do you think this process is going to help me as a practitioner gather information and looking like how relevant is from, I know it is, but I just want you to explain a little bit, how do you envision this tool to be useful for practitioners? Because these are a very important group in your stakeholder mapping. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So through, like if we take the example of the connectivity hub that we're developing, you'll be able to pull all of the relevant content with keyword terms like glacier retreat, and you'll be able to see who the key players are associated with them as well, just through bringing that data together and visualizing it. So if you clicked on glacier retreat within that tool, you'd have all the case studies that relate to that keyword term. So you'd see all the examples, and then you can see everyone who's working on that. And then you can keep clicking through and see what their expertise are and what else they're working on. And you could also see what terms are coming up and linked to glacier retreat that you also might want to explore, and that are linked to those other case studies. So it's kind of, you can really browse in a really visual way all the content that's coming up related to that term. So I guess it might just be. Yeah, so and in the climate services application, we'll certainly be using it in that way. So it'll be suggesting content based on you're answering like simple survey questions. So the semantics aren't so much being used in the tool, which is more just using keywords or trying to harmonize the use of keywords across those communities so that we can really start to link all the relevant case studies together and provide that enhanced accessibility to all that knowledge. But yeah, I think we could probably think about the practitioners a lot more, and especially moving forward in Weird Apps. So it'd be good to kind of keep following up on that discussion. Thank you.
One quick last one, please.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. Thank you. It was really interesting. So I was just this idea of sort of like the language, sort of the way that you can do the tagging could be a bit more top down versus bottom up, and it seems like I'm kind of using my kind of energy modeling terminology here. Sorry, but I guess I kind of view what you're doing as sort of like top down in that you're trying to say this is sort of academically how these words are supposed to be related, but then you could have sort of more of a sort of bottom up, how is it the practitioners are actually using the words? And I just thought it'd be really interesting if you could maybe sort of do a little study of what different outcomes you get, what different search outcomes you get on a top down versus bottom up, sorry, wrong terminology, to see if it gets people to, different types of knowledge. That might be quite an interesting research project in and of
absolutely.
itself.
Yeah, no, thank you, Charlie. That'd be really cool. We should do that for the Climate Services Initiative in the next phase, perhaps.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia.
Thank you.
Excellent presentation. And next up we have Georgia, who, as you might have noticed, the last three presentations were choreographed by the Oxford Center. Now we have a bit of an outlier, which is Georgia from the Seattle Center, talking about how movements can influence policy as well.
Great. Am I on? Yes. So I'm here actually on behalf of a small team that includes Claudia, Cleo, and Hannah and Philip from the Africa office. So we have almost every centre except Oxford and maybe Asia included here. Oh, sorry. Yes, you guys are in the same office. Sorry, I was mixing you guys up. Sorry, Cleo. I should know that. And I guess I'll start by saying I'm here to talk about something a little bit different. A lot of what we've heard this morning has been about what we might call convenient policies. Was it you, Clemens, or who was it that used the term inconvenient policies yesterday? And I borrowed that term because I think it was such an excellent way to talk about what we're doing in this project. I do a lot of the work in my research on the Fossil Fuel Initiative, and a lot of what we're dealing with is inconvenient policies. Policies that the call is not coming from governments for the most part, it's coming from the ground up, from civil society. Governments don't necessarily want to enact these policies for various reasons. And so what we're interested in this project is what role SEI plays, but also what role these movements play in shifting the policy arena. But first, to look at this question, we have to have some idea of how movements actually influence policy. So the rational choice model that's often used is one that you have people that are upset about a problem. This is a person, they want something in their environment to change, they want the policymaker to do something. They get together with a whole lot of other people, they form a movement, they call for a policy change, and we get policy change. This is sometimes also called the pizza model of mobilization, because it's much like ordering a pizza. I'm hungry, a few other people are hungry, we order a pizza, we get our need fulfilled. But this is actually not at all how mobilization works. For one thing, this idea that mobilization happens and is successful because people are deprived of something has been mostly debunked. Mobilizations are often mostly successful when they have good resources behind them, not just financial resources, people, the support of elites. And it's not a feature of whether you are the most deprived that means that policymakers listen to you, but whether you are the most organized. It also matters what sorts of tactics you use to try and change policy. And the policy landscape itself matters. So what type of policy you're trying to change, and also how we define success. Are you changing this direct policy, or are you changing the discourse around policy that enables new policies to be thought of and enacted in the future? And finally, the context matters. Whether you're mobilizing in a space that allows democratized dissent from people matters as to whether a mobilization is successful, and also all sorts of other things. If there's a hurricane and you're mobilizing for disaster relief policies, that's probably going to be a good chance that you're going to have success. So this more interesting and complex landscape is what we're looking at in this project. And we have a small seed grant to look at this with a project that we call the Mobilizing for Policy Change project, and we're looking at 3 case studies in depth to understand how mobilization has influenced a particular policy shift. And we've particularly chosen 3 cases where there was a significant amount of mobilization, and for the most part, people generally agree that that mobilization played a role, but I'll talk a little bit about that. And what we're doing is we're interviewing policymakers and people from the movement to get a sense of both what the movement was doing, but also how policymakers viewed the movement action. So the first of our 3 cases is in the US, and this is the case that I'm leading, looking at the influence of the Keep It in the Ground movement on 3 policy shifts that were all related, and distinct policy shifts under the Obama era to start addressing the supply side of fossil fuels. We're looking at the decision to stop Keystone, to deny the permit for the Keystone pipeline, the decision to stop leasing parts of the Arctic and Atlantic for oil exploration, and to put a moratorium on coal leases on federal lands in the US. And these are all really interesting policies because when Obama did these, he was one of the first people to enact policies focused on the supply side of the climate equation. In Colombia, we're looking at some actions that were taken by communities and local governments to enable more local decision-making around resource extraction. And we chose this case in particular because we're interested in alternative routes to policy influences in cases where governments weren't listening. So in this case, the national government wasn't receptive to the arguments of the movement, and so they worked through the court system to enact change. And then our final case is a case looking at long-term effects of a movement. So Cleo is leading the case looking in Kenya at the long-term effects of the Greenbelt movement on both land and forestry policy in Kenya, because we recognize that looking at direct policy shifts is one piece of the equation, but looking at also how a movement changes the way policy making is thought of and done over the long term matters too. And we're conducting interviews at the moment, so I don't have a whole lot to provide you other than a few illustrative quotes from our interviews that we've done so far, but we will be releasing a paper and a discussion brief on this by the end of the year. But what we have right here is a few rich in-depth qualitative cases, and we do want to expand this in future work, taking on a lot more cases, using more interesting techniques to look at how different factors come to play and which factors matter in which context. And also, we're quite interested at SEI as to what role the movement plays in getting knowledge mobilized. And this is the theme of our presentations today. So for the last little bit, I'm just going to focus on this piece of the puzzle. And that's this question of what role do movements play in the way knowledge is mobilized. And interestingly, from our research, we have actually picked one case that SEI has been quite involved in. So I have something to say about this. So SEI, through the Fossil Fuels Initiative, did release a number of reports on these decisions that we're talking about in the case in the US, including Keystone Pipeline, which is the example I'll talk about here. Michael, who's sitting over there, and Peter Erickson wrote a great report on the greenhouse gas emissions implications of the pipeline, and we can trace how that influenced the policy discussion. It was included in the Department of Oceans and Environmental Affairs final impact statement. It was included as a footnote, which even news articles picked up was an important footnote because it drew the link between the pipeline and its climate impacts. And ultimately, Obama did recognize that the pipeline would have climate impacts and made the decision to stop the permit from going through. So we can see this linear model of policy engagement at play here. We can see SEI releases its research, it gets into the policymakers' hands, and then we get a decision made. But we can also call this the pizza model of policy engagement. Because in actual fact, what happened in this case, and I think Michael will talk about this if you want to chat to him about it later, is that there were a whole lot of NGOs pushing for this work to happen as well. They wanted Obama to recognize the climate change impact. And it wasn't just that SEI was giving the policymakers research, but they were telling Michael and Pete ideas about things you could study and look at. They were putting this into the hands of policymakers. They were putting this movement behind the work SEI was doing. And so because we're interviewing policymakers about this decision and we're asking them about the different tactics that movements use to influence policy change, I was able to ask them what role the movements play in this research role, giving them research, providing them new ideas, helping them understand problems. And while I've had diverse responses on a range of other tactics, like whether protest is important or whether getting people to come to public comment is important, this one has been universally the same response from all policymakers, is that the movement is critically important in its research role. Policymakers don't typically have a huge amount of time to find new research. They're getting a lot from industry on whatever policy that they're trying to enact. And so having people bring them relevant, timely research on these topics is a crucial role of movements. And so I think it's important for SEI, when we're thinking about our policy engagement, to not just think about this linear pizza model and not just think about engaging with policymakers, but also think about who has the ear of policymakers and working with those movement actors as well. So I want to thank the Seed Innovation Fund for providing us funding to do this piece of work. But I'm also interested if anybody else wants to talk to any of us afterwards about whether others want to be involved in future work in this area, because we're now at a phase of thinking about what we do next. So all ideas are welcomed, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgia. Please stay. Questions for Georgia? Johan.
So, I think that a lot of people think that the linear model doesn't really exist in reality, and I'm not sure the pizza model is also, I mean, in that case, there's also the whole global climate community. It wasn't just a question of NGOs, and the NGOs put pressure on and the government then said, oh, okay. There were, I mean, it was also a question of probably individuals in the State Department and so forth. So I think in developing these models, there are lots of different models, and it's a very complex situation there. So certainly the NGOs and the movements play a part, but it's not the only.
I'll argue with you on that point that people don't think the pizza model exists in either mobilization,
well,
because you saw a lot of prominent climate economists come out and tell the movement they were focusing on the wrong targets, that they were doing the wrong tactics. You know, Stevens at Harvard, a lot of others lecturing the movement about how they were doing things wrong, that indicated that it's actually quite prevalent, this idea that you can just focus on a particular policy, bring up a movement, get the policy changed. So I'll argue with you a little bit that that's not a prevalent idea.
Yes, in the back, please.
Thanks, Richard Klein, Stockholm. Really interesting. I think it's great that you're doing this project, and I think it's very important that SEI better understands how knowledge gets used. I'm wondering if in the back of your mind there's also some concern about SEI possibly being co-opted by a movement that we may or may not agree with, and that perhaps the perception of others of SEI is one that's actually part of a movement rather than informing a movement.
I actually feel like Michael might be a better person to answer that in the context of fossil fuels. I think as SEI we can't control what happens with our research. I don't think this is unique to the fossil fuel initiative or others. I think anytime we're pushing on policies that policymakers might not be so receptive to. Movements may pick up our work and use our work in ways that we didn't necessarily intend them to, but I think that happens in the scientific community as well. We see it all the time with papers we write being miscited or misquoted. So I think maybe I'm not as concerned about that as perhaps you might be, but I think also that if we have a fear about that, we miss a huge opportunity to influence the policy sphere by not engaging with actors who might have a voice just because we worry about the way that they might use our work. I think we can do a lot more to keep communicating that we are this non-partisan group and that they are not representing us. If a policymaker says, you know, this group told us this and this about SCI, but I don't think we should shy away from working with groups that will push our work forward.
Thank you, Georgia. This is David Perkey from SCI Latin America. And
I can hear you, David, but I can't see. Oh, there you go.
It's interesting that you're developing this model of policy reform. Is the model of policy reversal symmetrical? Was there something that happened the other way when Trump came into office?
So we're not looking at that, but I think it's a very interesting question. I think it's a very good question. The other thing we're not looking at in this study that I would like to look at in the future as well is cases where there was a huge mobilization and the policy didn't change, where we would have expected based on a number of factors. So these are the sort of questions I would like to look at, is the counter movement and cases where we would have expected to see change and
Well, it seems like the U.S. one would be a good place if you wanted to study sort of this cyclical process of policy reform and then policy reversal, because and maybe reform again. So it seems like there's some longitudinal investigation there that would be interesting.
Michael, did you want to ask a question?
I just wanted to chime in with all the, great questions and comments, and of course, great presentation. Is that part of that process is getting to the role of SCI and the concern that we could be a tool of other organizations in the work we do is something that we think about all the time, and it comes up, and we saw it with some of the other work that's presented when NGOs latch on to our work and use it for their own aims. And I'd say one of the key things that we've tried to do, and I think is really important, is not just be in communication with other NGOs, but be in communication with other government actors. So right now, Pete, for instance, who was really key behind the Keystone work, we're working in California. We spend a lot of time in dialogue with people in California state government around the work that we're doing, so that we're not just communicating to one set of actors. And so that we can also, keep our bearings as straight as possible in these seas, which can be quite stormy at times when you get involved in them. But I think the key thing is, of course, just do good research and get it peer reviewed and make sure you're on track.
Okay. Last question, as usual.
Is it okay to make a comment? I was just going to say it is a particularly difficult time for us in the US at the moment. We are obsessing about being non-partisan, as they say in the US, but it's very difficult at the moment. Just Johan and I are working with EPA. Almost the act of working with EPA and talking about climate change is being partisan at the moment. So it's difficult.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Georgia, for your presentation. Excellent. And I would like to switch gears a little bit and get us to think a little bit more broader than what we heard in the presentations. And I'd like to maybe start off the discussion, and please, the presenters feel free to chime in on asking how can we get stakeholders on board. I think we learned from the presentations that there's no direct way to policy influence, right? And sometimes we have to take the detour through either be it movements or other stakeholders using different languages and trying to understand them and so on. How can we get them? How can we get them on board and not be worried about being nonpartisan all the time, but also trying to find allies for the causes that we're trying to push? Any thoughts on that? How can we align with other stakeholders, non-scientific stakeholders in our quest. Yes, please.
Something that we do in SEI Tallinn is that we work also with sharing good practices from other peers, from the policymakers that we're trying to influence.
Say that again. I couldn't hear.
We share best practices or good practices of peers of those policymakers who we're trying to influence.
Yes.
Well, for example, if we're working with cities, then we might share, if we want to influence a policy locally, like in the city of Tallinn, then we might share practices from another city who has taken on those principles that we're trying to move forward, for example, from Helsinki or Stockholm or other places that are neighbors and somewhat similar.
And how do you pick them? How do you identify whether they're best practices or just other practices?
Yeah, I don't know if it's done so systematically, but there's definitely the cities, I think, are interested in learning from each other. So even getting the cities together to ask questions to each other and to see what they can learn from each other is something.
So creating a dialogue, perhaps, but also I think that's also the role for science to analyze those practices and like tease out what are the success factors, perhaps.
Yes, and I think we do that in a lot of our projects.
Yeah, yeah. Any other ideas getting other stakeholders on board? Only one? Yes, please, behind you.
So we talked about co-production, and we talked about co-production, and that's
corporate action.
Co-production, knowledge co-production, and we do that in our work in AVM with systematic reviews. So we engage with stakeholders and actually do the co-design of the research before embarking on the research. So the way how we set up our reviews is to work with stakeholders, get the research questions from them, formulate those research questions, and then do a review. So, yeah.
I think that's an excellent point, and it should be actually standard in the scientific process. Not the scientists asking the research question, but actually the research question coming out of those perhaps that are affected by the issue.
Yeah, just to add, in medicine, for example, there is a movement for researching, for decreasing the research waste, and I really like that phrase. So it feels.
Decreasing research waste. That's great.
Just a quick comment.
Yeah.
So I think that, sort of the research questions that we tackle shouldn't only be other people. Sometimes, because then the policy is driving the research, and sometimes the research community is ahead of the policy. So, but I think the point is that you need to talk together about it in order to formulate, a good way of engaging with them in the development of the research. And I think there's a whole list of words that you could add here, too many for one flip chart. But I mean, one thing about
we have more paper.
Yeah, one thing about SEI, I mean, things like trust, the building of the relationships. A lot of people. We're working in Ghana at the moment, and it seems like the whole world is descending on Ghana. And I think the same is true of Nairobi. Suddenly, everyone's getting money to go down to Nairobi, and these policymakers are being inundated with people who don't want to do co-production and stuff. And so, if we're going to actually get to those people and work with them, we have to build a good relationship with them. Which at the moment, I see it's based on SEI's trust in SEI and the way we go about it, which is less confrontational than most and probably more worried about what they get out of it than other institutions. So I think that, what we've been doing, as an institute and our approach is really quite important. And it's also easy to destroy. So if we go about it in the wrong way and start doing what some other institutions going, sort of doing some research, writing a paper without including people on, that sort of thing happens a lot still. if we do that, then our reputation then is destroyed. So we have a good reputation, we've got to keep it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I'm nodding my head with Matthew Fearing from Stockholm Centre. I'm nodding my head with a lot of these approaches because we've used them in different contexts in relation to the kind of the opportunity we have due to our kind of partner makeup and how much engagement or how much access they have to policymakers. In a project in Bangladesh, we had a steering committee that was made up of some politicians there as well, and I think it's important that, it's kind of an obvious conclusion, but there's no one best method, and it's important that we have a toolbox that we feel is we're able to take advantage of based on the starting point, because the starting point could be we've been working 15 years in this country and have a great knowledge and trust and great relationships. We keep them going, but then of course we could be entirely out in the cold and not know a single person or have any access at all, and that's the reality for many of our projects. So it's really good to have sessions like this where we're coming up with different opportunities.
Okay, behind first, and then Nell. Oh, many. Okay.
Yes. Hi,
Okay,
Luca
first,
from the Stockholm office. I think one word that was also resonating yesterday was storylines. So I think also explaining actually to the new policymaker or decision maker that you're engaging how we have done that with other policymakers and other decision makers, possibly in a relevant context, is very useful. I think, making decisions is not easy, and decision makers are also sometimes struggling with that. So showing how we can bring value, how we can help them, and how we've helped other decision makers is a good way to get them that early kind of trust or idea to work with us.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Kevin Adams from the Stockholm Centre as well. I think one of the things for me that we're good at, but we could be better at, is just being responsive and showing up and being in the right place at the right time. And I think of this particularly in the context of some of the GCF work that I'm doing. A couple of weeks ago, there was a call that went out to the CSO observers of the GCF to provide feedback on their monitoring and evaluation policies. And two people in the whole CSO community responded, SEI and Heinrich Ball in the US. So that's a direct avenue to policy impact. And if people don't respond to the emails because we don't have a couple of hours to drum up some ideas as a team. So it was really good to sit down with some people at SEI and get some ideas out there. But being able to be responsive and change our plans and show up in the right places at the right time, it makes a huge difference.
Check your emails, people. Nella first, then behind, then Annalie. Yeah.
Yes, I think that we also need to take into account who we're going to get involved with. So this whole idea of co-producing and engaging with stakeholders, it's very interesting and very inviting. We all want to do that, but who to work with, how to select them, what are the best people to work with, because it's also about people, right? It's different when you work with someone that it's really easy and smooth and you can exchange things, and very difficult when you face a partnership with someone, with specific individual, that it's not very easy to work with. So there's not a direct answer for that. But I'm just want to raise that is working with others can be really rewarding, but it's not easy at all. Do you have any tips? I think that I think that there's a lot of long-term relationships are the key, and I think that is linked to this trust that Johannes was talking about. So we need to try to work with others and spend time with them in order to be able to identify who we can work best with and which are the best alliances, without losing the point that we also might need to play a role in raising the voices of the ones that are not included already. And if we can play a role in that, that can also be something very useful.
Thank you.
I already got the microphone. Well, sorry, just very briefly. The session is mostly about making our research useful, but it also seems to touch upon what kind of research we're producing to make it eventually useful. And the term, what did you call it, research waste or something, reminded me, well, I'm not so happy with it, I must say. Also working in a pure climate research institute, it's not always so obvious what kind of research you should push that eventually becomes useful. Sometimes more basic research can turn out to be very useful in the end, although it may not be pushed by any of our constituencies in the first place. It reminded me a bit of a figure that we had drawn here at SEI several years ago, which showed the full spectrum of research from pure research all the way to consultancy, let's say, and we would be placed somewhere in between. And it seems to me that it would be useful to not narrow our focus too much of only one type of research. We might benefit in the long run from being a bit broader and allowing research that is classified as waste research by some to also be on board.
Thanks very much. Just quickly on the waste, I think the research waste concept is more about the quality rather than the type. But yeah, and then I just wanted to pick up on something that Matthew said about toolboxes, and I think I just want to say that a lot of these skills that we're talking about are well developed methods in other fields. Stakeholder engagement is a huge field with a huge amount of methodology, so it's a little bit of a plug for the next session, which I'm running on toolbox for methods that we can learn from each other as an institution and learn from external best practices in how to do things rather than reinventing the wheel.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I forgot to introduce me before. I'm Anneli from the Stockholm Center. I just want to resonate with what Lucas said about storylines. And there are a few people in the Stockholm office who's now exploring storytelling as a stakeholder engagement method. And I remember that in the word cloud that we saw yesterday, storytelling came up very big. And I'm not sure why that is, but storytelling is popping up more and more and more, and it's been used in many other research sectors as a method for communicating. And so if anyone is interested or have worked a lot with storytelling, please approach me, because I would love to hear more about that now that we're going on this quest on exploring whether and how much effective it is actually as a way to reach stakeholders and get them to open up and build trust as well. Yeah, so that was just a comment from me. Do you want this back? Yeah, and maybe a session where we have some results actually. That would be really interesting, really fun.
Our other microphone has lost. The battery has died, so we're on one microphone.
Thanks. The focus of this conversation is very much on methods and how do you actually do this? And I think that's important, but I think the question of when to actually do it is also important. Building on what Johan and Kevin said, this isn't just about doing it within a project. This kind of stakeholder engagement isn't projectized. You don't build up trust if you just start thinking about this within the project and then bother the people that you want to talk to and find out that they don't have time. So what I'm supporting, and I know that Johan is very much in favor of this as well, is to try and build up these trust relationships over time outside projects, so that the challenge there, of course, is that how do you actually do that? How do you make sure that you're at the right place at the right time, that you have time to not only respond to emails, as Kevin suggests, but also go to meetings, have these interactions, go to the right workshops and so on. And I think that is a challenge that we're all facing. But in order to have effective stakeholder engagement and in the end also have policy impact, we need to think beyond this as a project activity.
Thank you. I think. Do you still have your question? No. Asa.
Hi, so Åsa Svarting from the Stockholm Center. I think Science Forum is a really great place to start sharing this experience. But on a more everyday basis, after all, we just meet once a year. So something we're trying to do within the capacity development pillar is to actually develop this online space for sharing knowledge on both tools, methods, and approaches, how we build capacity amongst our stakeholders. And co-production process is really crucial, important here. So it will be great to work with people and find ways to gather the experiences and try and visualize it and make this online tool really useful for people. But it's a two-way communication, collaboration. So it's not us doing it, but we need cooperation and people actually sharing their learning. Thanks.
Thank you. There was, I think. Oh, sorry. Sukaina was first. Sorry, and then you.
Getting a lot of exercise. It's good.
So I just wanted to share one example of, I think, quite an innovative model that we've used in the Southern African project that Liz described. So there, the policy, the program is called the Future Climate for Africa program. It's run by DFID and NERC in the UK, the research councils. And the way that the program was set up was proposals were supposed to be written with a 75% focus on climate science, and the rest was on learning and co-production. And we really pushed back on that when we wrote the proposal, and we flipped, there were pillars on climate science and then co-production and city learning. And we pushed back on that and flipped the model and wrote the proposal differently, and it was all bottom up. But also what we had is a setup in the cities, or what we have is, and this is all about the trust issue. So we have city stakeholders that we identified through previous partnerships, local universities in each city, and also one person who's an embedded researcher who sits in the city for the duration of the project and is the intermediary between the university and the city council authorities and the city stakeholders. And that has been a really innovative model that has worked very well for us in terms of developing that trust, but also what Richard said about having the entry points at the right time in the project to feed into policy. Because, for example, in Lusaka, there's been a recent cholera outbreak that's been in the news quite a lot. And a lot of our work in the city has been around the flooding and sanitation issues in the city and how that links to increased flooding in the future and long-term planning. So because of the relationships we had a good opportunity and entry point to sort of engage there. So I think there are these interesting models, but the more we can share and talk about what everyone's doing, I think that's really great.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more.
My last word is just to echo my friend Richard here. I think that this point on continuity and institutional memory is perhaps the most vital of all, because we are a very project-based institution, and I would argue, in fact, we're often an individual-based institution. If you put us on a spectrum of organizations from pure academic research departments and universities that are often entirely individual-based, which has its merits for intellectual freedom, right the way through to a very hierarchical consultancy, we're quite far to the first side of that spectrum. And I think it would do us well in areas where we really feel we've got value to add, that we get behind those areas and are confident enough to say we're going to focus more in these areas, whether we call them initiatives or programs or whatever, or just continuity of projects, and find the mechanisms needed to make sure that they join up. And accept, therefore, the implication of that, which is we don't do some other things, because I do think that, trying to look inwardly, I think we try and sometimes do too much, and that has a collateral impact. That brings a trade-off, and we'll never be able to maintain the trust and the long-term feedback and co-development relationships with real opportunities for impact if we can't stay in the game. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Last words from Johan. Of course, policy session this afternoon at 2 o'clock, right? Merged together with the capacity development session, the best session of the last 3 days. So please come. And I would like to thank you very much. If you have any more ideas or contribution, please send them to us, because we would like to write this all up, our lessons from this session, and perhaps create a little piece on co-production. Thank you very much. Enjoy your break.
Anyways, you're doing a great job. Yeah. You should be here. Let's follow up on that. Pick your brain.
Yeah, I'd love to chat about it. Yeah, and we'll pick each other's brain. I know it's something that one is keen to talk about. What basically needs is to be more. We need to accept having programs, financing, trades, whatever. And then we need to decide what that means. Program with capital P. All of the discussion we had in the Trade Task Force relevant to that. And it means that we need to be more vigilant about people applying for random projects that we don't have some expertise for, that we don't have the time for, that would impose a cost on other projects we're already involved in. So there's some dashboard, some alert. If someone puts in for a 2-year thing and you're already on a 5-year thing, like someone needs to know about that. So there's lots of health checks I think we can put in place to test that, and incentives to boost continuity.
No, I totally agree. And as long as we do it, I don't think that it's very successful.
And it does require being a bit more decisive in leadership, which requires internal leadership.
Agreed with what you said.
And if the people that are in leadership positions are the right people to be making those kinds of decisions, then that requires some adjustment. Because you need some intellectual confidence to be making decisions like that. Were you in our session yesterday? Did you miss it? Good. Oh, you are? Oh, if you can sit a bit further away.
She's always a bit contagious.
Yeah.
In various forms.
I started watching it online, but the Ministry of had to do that, so I actually missed it, but I will revisit it.
It was great fun.
Are you up there?
It was great fun. And people, there's lots of positive feedback, and apart from us having fun.
People actually took some of it seriously.
Yeah. There was some particular but then
Oh. There you go.
We need the bell.
Yes. Nella, where's Nella ringing the bell? I can do it. Ian, shall I do it? But where are your speakers? But you first. So it goes, wait. It goes like this. Over like that.
Ooh. I feel like Madonna.
Right?
But,
And then you put this.
thank you. Ooh, slippy. Perfect.
Nice.
So we're going to do all of the presentations. We'll do all the presentations in the first half an hour back to back, and then have a discussion. Yeah, perfect. I think we'll just swap this actually. We can just swap this one quickly in between.
Eric and I have.
We have two actually, so you can each have one, and we won't take any questions because. Yeah.
Can I open a browser quickly?
Yeah, sure. No, I don't think so. So we have to use this. Go for it. Sorry. What's good? And then, oh, I'm not sure now. I think it's these guys. I think they might be with Ian. Hello.
Hey.
Awesome dungarees.
I'm off duty.
No.
Good.
No. Other than coming in and letting us share in. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Is that the most up-to-date version?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. I haven't tried it actually.
Just in case, try.
I can't log into my email here. Do you have access to the Prezi yourself? Because I.
So,
Yeah, absolutely.
until I forget it somewhere, and then I have to buy a new clipping.
That's snug.
So it's not, I don't think it's not actually on, is it? Oh, it is. Oh, it's on.
We've not met actually.
I've seen you several times.
Yes,
but
around the
maybe
office.
I haven't introduced myself.
No.
Lovely.
Neil, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for speaking. Yeah, if you could sit near the front, and then we'll do presentations back to back. We won't have any questions, but
Here.
have a discussion.
Hey.
I have the order is up on the third slide, I think. I think it's.
Okay.
No, not until all the speakers are finished. No questions either. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Cool.
Okay.
Awesome. So we can leave that open in the background, right? Then I think these guys, I'll put up the order on the third slide. Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Cool. We won't have any questions actually. But... Okay, guys, we'll make a start. If you could come in and grab a seat, that'd be great. We're running a little bit behind, but we have lots of time to chat. So, welcome everyone. My name's Neil Hadaway. I'm a research fellow at the Stockholm Centre. I wanted to have this session mainly. Could someone just push the door shut at the back, please? Thank you. So I wanted to have this session mainly to talk about across the centre how we use methods, how we develop them, and how we share expertise, and how we're seen externally in terms of our methodology. Many projects are very well externally showcased, they're very well developed, but how we learn as an institution and how we share information, I think, could be better. So we're a big organisation. It's often really difficult to know who has what skills when we're applying for funding. We might know that a certain methodology is needed. And unless you know everybody in the organization, it's very difficult to know who you might involve based on their methodological expertise. Often we're running under very limited resources and time when we need to deliver on a project. So if we're jumping between projects and maybe entering a space where we need to learn a new skill, it can be quite difficult to learn that skill rapidly, to share from our colleagues, and to stay up to date when methodologies are rapidly developing. It's also difficult when we're starting out at SEI to know in our own careers which methodologies should I develop personally, which should I learn and get skills on to use in my career at SEI over a long period of time. And there is also limited or virtually no dedicated funding, as Toby was saying, for institutional learning, for institutional capacity building within our own organization. So this made me start to think these questions. How do we stay up to date with methodological developments? How do we share methods between each other? And how do we ensure that the methods that we're using as an organization are high quality and fit for purpose? And also, how do we showcase our skills externally when we're using methods? Do we need to have something on our website that says we are the world leader in a certain methodology? Is it something that we can sell ourselves on? And so this kind of boils down to one big question. Do we need a consolidated approach to capacity building, method development, and showcasing? So we're going to have some presentations on 4 key sets of methods that by no means are what we think are the most important methods, but in consultation with the management team and volunteering from our wonderful colleagues, there are some examples of methods which have been, perhaps in some cases, fairly well developed and consistently used, and in other cases might be novel methods that are on the horizon and might really be a space that we want to dedicate resources to. So I'm going to be talking about evidence synthesis. Karin and Sarah are going to be talking about participatory and citizen science methods. Eric and Kalle will be talking about scenarios and foresight. And then Larry and Clement will both be talking about big data. And then after this session, which will just be presentations, we'll save times for talk until the very end if we can. We're going to have a brain walk. And this will involve taking a bit of time to move the chairs to the side, but walking around 4 stations at each of the corner of the room to talk about, in small groups, the following questions. What methods do you use? And who else do you think is using them across SEI? Is the communication between you well enough to support sharing of learning around the methodology? As a member of SEI, do you find it hard to learn a new method, or conversely to share that method if you think you've got something to share? Thirdly, do you think it's important that we help share methods to build capacity, develop methods, and showcase externally? Is it a priority? Is it not? Where does that priority sit? And then a very direct question, would you benefit from a central support desk for a method or for a suite of methods? What might a methods toolbox, as Matthew mentioned, look like? How might we institutionalize that in an efficient way? So since I have the mic, I'm going to carry on and give our first presentation. Sorry, the computer's a little bit slow. So for anybody who was at Biljana's talk yesterday, you'll already have a really good grasp of evidence synthesis. It's evidence synthesis is a suite of methods that have been brought into SEI in the start of 2016 when Mistra Eviem joined the institution. I'm just going to run you through why evidence synthesis is a methodology, why we need to share skills in it because it's very complicated, and what those skills are. So as we all know, because we work in a policy think tank, when there is, we're faced with these topics that are important and people need answers. And because of a need or an uncertainty in the evidence base, because of controversy and disagreement in many of the topics that we're dealing with on a daily basis, because of a need for accountability and transparency in the work that we do, and a need for objectivity, and often because there is a large and disparate evidence base when we're trying to do reviews and understand an evidence base as a whole, the kind of traditional literature reviews that we might be very familiar with, that I did regularly before I started working in evidence synthesis, are subject to fatal bias and limitations. And we might see this in some of our own work if we were to reflect back on it, that this traditional approach to reviewing literature perhaps isn't as reliable as it needs to be if we want to really inform critical decision making. And I just wanted to run through that really quickly with you now. If you imagine a hypothetical evidence base in the green, many literature reviews just select studies that they're familiar with, and that means that they are subject to selection bias. They might be a set of studies that agree to a certain preconception. They might be studies that I've picked because I know that they're all positive, for example. Many literature reviews aren't comprehensive. They might only be looking at one database or one portion of the literature. Many of them miss grey literature. We're fairly familiar in SEI with grey literature, but a lot of academic reviews miss the organizational reports and research that was never published because of publication bias. And that publication bias comes in where editors, peer reviewers, and authors ourselves choose not to publish research that is not positive, not significant, and not easy to explain. Very few traditional reviews have enough transparency to allow repeatability or verifiability. And if we want to gain trust, as we heard in the last session, having that transparency in all the decisions that you make when you review articles is really vital. Vote counting is something that is done often within an analysis within a review where you tally up the number of positive or negative studies, or ones that are significant versus ones that aren't. And that ignores the magnitude of effect, and it ignores the quality of studies as well. So there are a number of ways that you can get around this, but most reviews will have some aspect of vote counting or quality bias. And then discussion bias happens where we focus on some studies because they're easier to explain, or we like the result in our discussion. And so systematic reviews and systematic maps, this is what we mean when we talk about evidence synthesis. These are formulated, well-developed methods that we've learned from and we're helping to develop now. And they have a very stepwise, systematic approach that supports you through the process of setting your question, planning your methods in advance, searching for articles, screening them for relevance, extracting data, assessing the quality, and then synthesizing that research. And that formulaic approach sits on the central tenets of transparency, repeatability, and objectivity, trying to maximize those. And just briefly to say how systematic reviews do it, they try to be exhaustive in their searching, so they don't just look for one portion of the evidence base. And they do that trying to be comprehensive by searching multiple different databases, sometimes 20 bibliographic databases, sometimes hand-searching journals, calling for evidence. And they also search for grey literature. So we try and get organizational reports from key organizations, from consultancies, from academics who didn't publish their research, from preprint servers, things like that. And we also report every single decision that we make so that the review is completely verifiable and repeatable. And we then weight studies to make sure that the more reliable and more valid evidence has a higher weight in our analysis, either quantitative or qualitative data. And then all the studies get synthesized to make sure that, that we're analyzing the evidence base as a whole. So these methods have been in SEI for about 2 years. When Eviem moved to SEI, we already had developed and used those methods for a long time. Eviem started in 2012 based at Corvéa. Since we've moved to SEI, we've had a number of colleagues who've come to us asking for advice in how to make their reviews more systematic. This kind of review is very expensive and time-consuming, but you can take principles of it, like transparency, and make your reviews much more reliable. So you have all of this data on your hard drive when you do these reviews. If you just put it in supplementary information, then you're much more transparent. You have that level of trust. And so to kind of summarize, SEI has been doing traditional literature reviews. I did them before, so I'm not being hugely critical. But we can now learn as an institution from this rapidly expanding movement called evidence synthesis. In the field of healthcare, if you want to publish a review, you can't publish it if it's not a systematic review. No one will let you because they're not reliable. And now in the field of environment, we're seeing that happen as well. So we see funders ask for systematic reviews. Bonus asked for an evidence-based review for the project that we then became, we applied for and then became Bonus Return. It's becoming more common. If we don't embrace this, then we're going to get left behind. And how I think we can embrace this in the future is by having a support desk in the same way that we've done that with the Unlock project and some of the other projects that our colleagues have worked on. We can share capacity, share learning resources. So we do training within SEI, we can put those online, we can have a repository with this kind of information so that you can learn as an institution, and we can help to develop those methods. And when it comes to external showcasing, I think SEI can and should be a world leader in evidence synthesis. We're one of the most important organizations developing these methods. At the moment, we've had been very lucky to have core funding from MISTRA for 5 years, or 6.5 now. But I think it's really important that going forwards, we carry on with that inertia to still be seen as the place to get methodological help and support in how to do this kind of thing, because it's going to be increasingly more demanded by funders and by commissioners in the future. So we can save questions if it's okay until the end. I don't know if there are any questions, but we'll move on now to Karin and Sarah. There we go. Thanks very much.
Okay, so we're shifting focus from reviews to stakeholder engagement and participatory approaches, which is really key to many of the projects and the research that we do here at SEI. And I think, as we heard over the days at the Science Forum, participatory approaches are widely used across SEI and for different purposes, and there is no one single method or one single way of doing this type of research and projects, but I think that we can see many different examples and also many different degrees of participation from different types of stakeholders. But what do we mean when we talk about participatory approaches? I mean, it's very simple. It's when we involve stakeholders and lay knowledge in the knowledge production process. And it can be through various methods, techniques. And the key thing is that they share their knowledge, values, and perspective in relation to the different issues that we have at stake. And in the projects I've been involved in, we used a lot the concept of science stakeholder dialogues, which is one approach to the participatory methods. And I'm going to share with you some of the lessons from one of the projects on climate change adaptation in Swedish forestry. And I'm presenting these lessons, and I think many of you recognize these lessons and also the challenges they involve, and I hope we can continue the discussion around these later today. And first of all, which is we have heard many times during the Science Forum, is to ensure representation from all relevant stakeholder groups, but also that they have the organizational backup to participate in the process. And then to prioritize a carefully designed and facilitated process to ensure that we build trust between stakeholders, and also that we facilitate this mutual collaboration and also joint problem definition. And how do we do that? And then another aspect that is really important is to strengthen the stakeholder sense of ownership throughout the process, and also that we value the diversity of different perspectives. And related to that, SEI is often played a role as the facilitating and/or boundary organization, and that shouldn't be underestimated when we gather different stakeholders and experts around these topics. And that is also important to promote openness and to have this trusted process. And in the project I've been involved in, it's been experts, for example, climate scientists and practitioners that are cooperating, but also scientists from different academic disciplines, and that is also a challenge in itself, which is important to acknowledge and also embrace. And lastly, to ensure the practical relevance of the process or the project, it's important to encourage co-arrangement and the co-creation of different activities. And as you can see in the picture, it's from one of the forest excursions that was organized together with stakeholders and scientists to explore various aspects related to climate adaptation. And that was one of the activities that was the most well received, and that people really enjoyed and said that they learned a lot from having this excursion. So it's also about finding the right meeting places where you can share experience and learn from each other. So having that said, I leave over to Sarah, who will present.
Yeah, let me try. How's that? Yeah, okay, I might have to, this is a bit wonky. Okay, so I'm Sarah West, I'm from the York Centre, and I want to talk to you about, I'll just hold it like this, I think. I want to talk to you about citizen science, which is a participatory approach which we at the York Centre have been doing for a decade now. So when I say we, that's myself, Sarah West, Alison Dyke, who's in the audience, give us a wave, Rachel Pateman, and Mike Ashmore, who's a professor who works with us. Citizen science is basically where scientists and, shorthand, non-scientists work together to answer scientific questions about the world. And with any citizen science project, we've been thinking about this a while and realised that there's a few steps that we always follow. So every project is different that we do, but there are a few steps that we follow with any project. So I'm going to start by talking about citizen science projects that are scientist-led, and then I'm going to move on to talking about citizen science projects that are citizen-led. So this is a sort of diagram of what happens in the scientist-led projects. So here a scientist comes to us, or we have an idea ourselves that we think citizen science could help with. So for example, you need lots of data over a wide geographic area. You need lots of detailed data from a very specific site. It's an area that you can't normally get to as a scientist, perhaps people's back gardens, for example. You want to work with ordinary people, and you want to perhaps inform decision making at either the local level, regional level, or national level. So then we talk to the experts in the field and find out, well, what are the knowledge gaps? What are the research questions that citizen science could help with? We then present to the scientists and often to citizen scientists at this point as well, the range of methods that could be used in such a project, taking into account things like what the budget is, which is always important, of course, the scale of the project, who we and they want to work with, accessibility, etc. We then refine the project methods, and then we'll pilot the methods with citizen scientists and administer the project. No, it's fine. I'm happy just holding like this. It's a good look. Thank you. No, I'm fine. So I've only got this slide, so I'll only be 1 more minute. Thank you. So the alternative path, which is arguably more exciting, is where a group of citizens or individual people come and approach us with a big idea that they want some support with. So this might be how to deal with waste management issues in Ida camp in the West Bank, or it might be trying to find out about what the constituents of breast milk are past 6 months, which is Parenting Science Gang, which is the Facebook symbol in the middle there. So a group comes to us, says we've got an idea that we'd like some support with. So we start off by discussing what they want, what their needs are, and then we use our contacts both within SEI and within the University of York, which is a really big university where there's lots and lots of different expertise. We use our contacts to find experts who will meet the needs of the citizens. actually, at this point, a lot of our work is translating between groups. So it's kind of translating the scientists' language, who maybe don't usually do any public engagement, into kind of language that the community members understand. And then we, again, decide our methods, considering budget, scale, etc., and including the platforms that we might use for engaging people. So, for example, in Parenting Science Gang, it's entirely run on Facebook. We've had, I think, one face-to-face meeting in the 2 years of the project. And then we refine the project to make sure it meets everybody's needs. So that's all I wanted to say. Hopefully there'll be time for questions later on.
Yes, we're on. Yes, and it's about a kind of heritage toolbox that's been with SEI since the very beginning, using scenarios and different foresight methods to argue about possible future developments. Some people have worked a lot with this, others have been involved a little bit. Many of us have not worked with it at all, so we thought of this a little bit of crash course in this field. Oh, is this the right one? Yep. No, this is not the right one. Did you not say? No, I thought you said. Wow, no. Then we need to switch computers. Or should we take another group in between instead? And yeah. Yeah.
All right. So I wanted to talk about, it's not going to be about big data, it's more going to be about the best practices in software development and how I think we should import them into the way we work at SEI. So just for a short story of how Trace started, when I joined SEI 3 years ago, Trace didn't exist, but Javier Godard had developed a model that really led to the development of the Trace platform. And this model was published in a very successful paper, but it was supported by a few Excel sheets and a few lines of code written in different languages. And overall, it did the job. It led to very exciting results, but the way that the data and the code was handled was not good. And what I've been trying to do over those 3 years is to maybe improve the way we work with data sets and code in general. And my pet project has been to develop the GitHub page for SEI. And I have to apologize that I haven't updated with a new visual identity, but I'm going to do that later today. And I think that there's a few best practices in industry about how to develop software. And that includes the buzzwords that you sometimes hear about, like agile development. And a lot of it is really not relevant for SEI. But I think that SEI is maybe in between industry and purely academic research. So I think due to that positioning, I think there's a few things we can import from the way code is written in industry. And that includes, so to say a bit more about Agile, we've been working with contractors, and I've learned a lot by looking at how they work. And I think Agile is, it's a great word, it sounds very interesting and exciting, but you can't really apply it in any context. But there's a few key ideas that I discovered and I found quite surprising, and I think would be maybe stimulating for you to hear about. One of the principles of Agile is when you work on a project, always start with the most difficult thing. It might sound a bit counterintuitive, but the reason is that if you realize that it's not achievable, then you just revise your ambition level. And that's interesting when you have constraints, because we all have time and financial constraints in the projects that we run. So I think it's a very good principle to have. I'm not saying that we always do that, but it's just a way to maybe change the way you think about projects. Another principle is when you set the deadline before you decide what you're going to do by that deadline, which is also counterintuitive. So you say, okay, in a month, I want to have this feature, it's called feature industry, but for a project, I want to have this deliverable. And then you backtrack and say, okay, how much can I get done in a month? And it's different from thinking about, I want to have that platform, and then in 6 months' time, you're not there yet, so you extend your deadline to a year and a half, and you know how it goes. So, and then now I'm going to focus on GitHub, which maybe in a few words is like a public website that allows to host code projects and to facilitate version control, which is a very important best practice of writing software. When you write a piece of code, it's very important to keep track of what has happened, what are the changes that you've made, of remembering who did what change that created that bug, who can we blame for this mess. So it allows you to keep track of every single change to a text file and have a very good system of going back in time and seeing when a problem was introduced. So yeah, GitHub is a website that allows you to host your projects and has some nice interfaces on how to navigate through the history of your projects. But it can be used both for private project development. So you see here Trace. This is our main repository where we have all the code. You have a nice way to document your projects. You write a README file that is nicely formatted with instructions on how to contribute. So this is for the private part where you can really work with a small group of collaborators within or outside of SCI. It's possible to control, and it's not visible from the outside. Another nice feature is you can visualize the history as a tree. So you see that currently we have Toby Reed, the new developer who's working and who's been writing those commits, which are like changes to the code. This is what I've done yesterday. So anyway, so it's a very good tool, and you can also write about issues with the code, have discussion threads that refer to that are connected to different parts of the code, where you can discuss new features or how to solve some problems. But there's also a public side to it, and this is where I would like to emphasize that. So the session is called Big Data, but don't be intimidated by big data. Don't be intimidated by code or software development. Even if you have 100 data points and a small script that you wrote in MATLAB or R or whatever language you like, it is better to put it up there on GitHub than leaving it on one of your laptops that maybe is going to crash, maybe the hard drive is going to burn, and it's going to be lost. And I want to show you something that you can do with GitHub is you can have those public repositories. So yesterday in a Trace session, we mentioned about the transformative transparency platform, which we developed and which led to this temporary website that we used for fundraising that is now outdated. But you can still see the code that was related with that project on GitHub. And you can even have a digital object identifier. And we have used this DOI to put a formal citation to this work in a paper that we've published a few years ago. And that's something great because I didn't want to write a paper about it. It's a small project we did over a few months. I didn't want to spend another 6 months to clean up the code and document it and write a whole paper. But now I can have a link to it. And I think this is something you should really consider if you want to publish gray literature and make it a bit more white or a bit more, I don't know. You should do that. So you can see that the code is still hosted there. You can see, I'm not going to let it load, but you can see the tools. And some people have used it. I know that someone in a university downloaded that and used it for their own visualizations. Another example of tools that we can make public is So you see those repositories that are called like private. You cannot see them, but any name here that doesn't have private, you can see it. So you see that Eric recently created a repository for his own project, and not this one. Yeah, the one up there, Next Gen Energy. And now he's working this with his own team of people in Boston who all contribute to the project. What I wanted to show you is another repository that is called the Trace Tools. And I think this is, it's a great place to share some small tools that you think might be useful. And what we faced when we worked on Trace is that Brazil is a big country. There's like more than 5,000 municipalities. And when you get data about Brazil, sometimes you have a name of a municipality that the data correspond to. But of course, there's a lot of states in Brazil, and a lot of cities have the same name. So how do you deal with that? Well, there's unique codes that are defined by the government. And very often you need to go from a name of a city to the code, because you want to identify it uniquely. So here we've developed a small tool that is a standalone. It doesn't require you to have any complex database or anything. It just runs in Python. You just need to be able to run a Python script on your computer. And it goes from the name of a city in Brazil and the state it belongs to, and it gives you that unique ID. And that's one example of a tool that can save literally days of work for someone who's dealing with a new data set. So what else did I want to say? Well, yeah, so I was talking earlier about how the bar is lower than you think to use this kind of tools. I'm managing the account for SCI. Currently, we only have, I think, 13 people who join, but I really encourage you, if you write any kind of code, don't be intimidated. Just contact me, create an account here. I can send you very brief and simple instructions on how to host your code. And that will allow us to really share the code that we write and make sure that it's saved somewhere and can be used by other projects. Thank you.
Working? Okay, okay, it's working now. Excellent. So, I hope it will work. I have hugely ambitious title, but very little content to share. So, but it's rather to really spark interest and discussion on the issue of big data. Okay. So how can I get it now started? Still loading. No. It's loaded? Okay. Yeah. Okay. This was a sound bite that I overheard last week. I was in OECD Foresight meeting. There was all over the world OECD member states, the leading Foresight people there, talking about building different scenarios about the future for the kind of to advise Secretary General of OECD on a possible future changes on a global landscape and governance level. So it was really a high level discussion, but what was, common in every discussion was the issue of big data and artificial intelligence and augmentation of reality. So it was really how this changes, how public services are made, how health services are provided, how military services are provided, how research is done. So as Clement was saying, it's not relevant today for every problem, and it will never be relevant for every problem in the world. However, the tools are becoming more widespread, the bars get lower and lower and lower, and there are more and more actors who at one point might easily discover that their tools could be applied very easily in environmental and sustainability research area. And then if we as an organization don't, kind of equip ourselves with the knowledge and the experience and build the bridges now, then I think we will be much less relevant in 10 years' time along the way. So yeah, as I said, I think it will change the way we work. It already changing. These are not important to read the post-its, but rather it was to signify all the signals and the changes that people were marking down last week at the OECD that's going to happen. And we see more data-driven companies like Estonian startup Planet OS, which is about making data available. They are much better at it than national governments. The business model is they are linking different national and research data sets, and they will serve as a filter to make these data, kind of processable. So the issue is always that you might even get a bunch of data, but it's very bad quality, it's not transparent, it's not cleaned up. So they do this. And it opens up, again, new research questions that you might answer, new possibilities for companies. They service now a lot of energy companies with their data. But they are adding more and more data sets to their platform, global platform. Oh, and then I think a month ago or so, Google then announced that they now offer machine learning as a service. They introduced very simple tool. It's more focused on image recognition and services and analysis based on this, but I'm sure they will expand. In 2 months' time, we will have another niche product, and so on and on. And all these tools make our life easier. We don't have to have everything in-house. It's impossible to have in-house. I think a smart way for us is to build bridges and collaboration networks with organizations that really have this very highly specialized knowledge. However, we definitely always need people who can talk to them, who can ask questions and speak in the same language with them. So I think this is the kind of the message part. About the baby steps at SCI Tallinn. So what we did was we had a bigger project, Naturs, on green urban areas. So we did a lot of different things. Among that, we worked with the municipal governments from Tallinn and Helsinki, and we helped to map the ecosystems. We helped to also surveys among possible visitors to these green urban ecosystems. What do they value about it? What do they expect about it? And there was also very concrete outcomes. There was new boardwalks being invested by both municipalities based on these analysis to make more accessible the green areas. But however, within that project, we also did analysis based on mobile position data, because there's an Estonian company who's very good at using anonymized mobile data. So it just tracks the mobile points and their activity in the networks, triangulates, and they can, without putting name that Lauri was there, but anonymized. And they also, what is good about it is that they recognize whether it's Estonian number, Finnish number, Russian number, or Swedish number, or French number. And they can track it by minute, by hour, by day, by week, month. So imagine if you would try to get this data about visitor movement. How would you go about it? But here, it's just, they built the solution and the code, and now it's, applicable to so many possible questions. Here, our question was really simple one. Who visits at what time? The most basic of them all. And yeah, so it was about this temporal pattern of mobile call activities. So whether it was just in your pocket, beeping to the mobile towers or you were making calls, it could track. So we tracked 2 areas. You could have the average number of visitors per day. We could have the peak moments. We could have the number of unique visitors per month. How many were recurring? Imagine if you would really try to do this with the survey or traditional counting methods. How many people you would impossible. But here it was really building a code and then pushing the button. So yeah. We also have submitted a project using the same mobile positioning data activity to analyze the possibilities of instituting or introducing demand-responsive public transport. Because the problem is that in rural areas, you have the buses going at the random points. Historically, there's routes. Why they are there? Do they follow the actual movement pattern of the people? How could public transport much better respond to the actual demand for the mobility in dispersed areas? So that's one of the projects that will start, hopefully. Then, you could use this if you take, for example, pollution data. In urban areas, there's factories polluting. You can have this mobile data and pollution data and then model how many people are affected that are permanently living there, how many are passing through, how many are passing through repeatedly, how many of them are locals, how many of them are from France or whatever. So there's just really a myriad of opportunities, and that's only one type of data. That's mobile position data. But there's so much of social data that you could use in your better understanding the community that you're working. So really, my point here is only to say that we are very much interested in trying to build up this capacity. We are very much interested in collaborating with other centers, and let's learn together and think of where can we institute and integrate these new approaches into our work in the future. And yeah, just to highlight and as a teaser, we will have in the afternoon the meeting on the SCI Horizon Scanning project that Research Directorate approved. I think it was in February or March. So I'll be leading the team, but there's also Erik, there's also Kalle, there's also Kairi within the group. We will have the internal discussion beforehand, but we thought if there's interested people, we will have after 3 o'clock also possibility to people come and join and discuss with us what the Horizon Scanning is about. But inside the Horizon Scanning, in addition to the more traditional survey-based approach that we will do as well, there's also the element that we try to innovate. So one of the outputs that we want to have is terms of reference, kind of a concept for how to build a tool that could analyze data from key target sources. So Horizon Scanning has an aim to really track what are the hot topics now, what are the key issues in the medium term, and what are the long-term kind of weak signals or important major changes that could happen on a sustainability field. And we will complement the survey that we will do also with a new tool for targeting. For example, we are thinking about Twitter, tweets, what are the topics and issues that people are tweeting, possibly scanning also the abstracts of academic journals, or you could have patents. This is a work completely, we only have the desire to do that tool. So how do we build it in a modular fashion? This is a journey we are just now starting. But yeah, so it could also serve us in terms of really, building a strategic view of the future and complement the knowledge that we already have anyway, but to put it in some sort of living wiki type of environment where it's constantly evolving over the time. But I would stop here. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes. And actually, don't you think, Eric, that our presentation comes quite nicely here at the end? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah?
Let's say that it did. But actually, it is good. It's nice that it follows along the horizon scanning, because that's a particular example of a foresight technique, and we're going to be talking about, well, barely talking about them, but showing how many there are that are available.
So let's keep fingers crossed this is the right one. Yes, that looks perfect. Yeah. Yeah, so getting back where we were, different methodologies for foresight and particularly scenarios is something that we worked with SCI since the very beginning. Some of us have been more involved, others less. But for all of these methods, I think to begin with, it's important to think about how we relate to the future, because most of the work that we actually do are about the future, informing about the future or understanding the future. But we don't really often reflect on how we look upon the future. Is the difference between desired futures, for example, or plausible futures or likely futures. Basically, we're in the middle of this stream of different drivers and factors that shape the future. And all these methods are about trying to argue with how these futures could develop and to use different frameworks, methodologies, and cooperation processes, participatory processes to gather information and arguments about that. And basically, there are three ways of relating to the future. You have a historical pathway. You could start from that pathway and look ahead, try to predict the future. And this type of methodologies are called foresights, typically economic foresight, weather forecast, and things like that. A lot of modeling usually here that goes in on trend analysis. Another way is to start from the future, a place where you want to be in the future, a vision for the future, a normative idea of where we want to go, and then look back to today from that position and say, okay, how do we navigate? What policy options and pathways are there to reach that particular future? And here I think the best example right now is Agenda 2030. It's a normative scenario or image for where the world wants to be at 2030. The third way is something we call explorative. And that's the approach we use, for example, in the Mr. Geopolitics program, and we have used in many other projects as well. Here we try to understand how different uncertainty factors could shape plausible futures, which we relate, so to say, indifferent to. These are not wished for futures. These are not, necessarily negative future, but this is what could happen. And then we ask the question, okay, how do we, what actions could we take in order to navigate this future as best as we could? And here I hand over to Eric for some more insights on different methodology choices that we have at the toolbox.
So what you're seeing here is different ways of extrapolating to the future. When we're talking about foresight and scenario techniques, we rarely take the predictive approach, because the kind of systems we're talking about, these linked ecological social systems, have complex behaviors that make them fundamentally uncertain, the future. And so we more likely turn towards the normative or explorative approach.
And there's a wonderful indication of what you just said. And if you've seen the IMF forecasts for economic growth in the world since 2011, they have to make a new forecast that goes up all the time, but the reality goes down. So that's a beautiful explanation for that. Yeah.
And I just want to make clear that even though we end up talking about scenarios a lot, and there's a lot of scenario work at SEI, these foresight techniques. That is, how do you think in a structured way about the future? These are techniques for doing that. It's a great deal more than scenarios. And I'd also mention there's really a couple of layers to this. So one is practical techniques for assisting people in thinking about the future. And there's also thinking about the future. There's an academic field called future studies. And some of us contribute there as well. But you can see it's a lot more than scenarios, and some of us know about a few of these different techniques. We might have used them. Otherwise, if you're curious, we can fill you in. And in fact, SEI has generated a few methods. Some of these are out and published, but other ones are, even if they're not published, they're ones we're using actively in our work. And there's probably more than these. These are the ones that I was aware of. What have we done in this space? Actually, a lot. SEI convened the Global Scenario Group many years ago, which was a long-standing, an extended project to think about the future, convening people from around the world. And that's had a pretty serious impact on subsequent work.
This was in the 1990s, so it's a long time ago.
We've contributed to several global environment outlooks. So the list that I've got here is global activities, comprehensive assessment of water management and agriculture, and contributed to the newest round of climate scenarios through the shared socioeconomic pathways. That's at the global level, but we have done a lot of work on scenarios and futures thinking at regional level, national level. Every LEAP and WEEP application, the software is designed around a scenario approach, and so every LEAP and WEEP application has some scenario in there. And we've developed methods and tools ourselves and then applied them. So where do you fit in? If you think about the future, then this is appropriate for you. So what kinds of things can you do? There's foresight methods and workshops. Some of them take a couple of hours, and they're straightforward to use, and they can help stimulate thinking. They can go up to a week, some of these methods, if you really want to do a deep dive. We've also done project-sized foresight processes, stakeholder engagement, creative storytelling, analysis, and then also future studies, thinking about the future. And all of this is these are things that people at SEI have done, and there are quite a few of us in the room, and you're more than welcome to join us and join this collection of people sharing methods and talking about what we're doing. Or if you just want to draw on us for expertise, can I say for all of us, we're all available as well, so to help you with that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone. Those are some really interesting talks. Hopefully that stimulated some ideas about methods. We're going to be a bit agile, I think, in how we use methods for this session because we're quite over time. We've got 20 minutes left, roughly. What I thought we could do is have questions, not specifically about individual methods, maybe, but questions and comments about how you use methods, how you perhaps want methodological support. These kind of questions that I put up earlier. So, does anybody have any thoughts about these kind of questions? Do you think that the support we have at the moment is enough when you need to learn a new method? Do you often actually need to learn new methods? Do you have any questions or comments? Yeah, Claudia.
Thank you. So it's about sharing across SEI what kind of methods we use. I found a bit difficult when I arrived to get out of what I already knew, thought I knew how to do it, and what the people I worked with would do, and I felt a bit constrained. I thought when AVM joined, it was great because they took the time of presenting what they were doing. I mean, they were really busy running lots of systematic reviews, and they organized a few workshops to tell us what they were doing and how they were doing it. And I think what was great to get to know this work and then to think about our work and how we can implement it with the support of the team. So maybe that's a first step. Also, it's to take the time of thinking, okay, what do we do that maybe is interesting for other researchers, and prepare a BBL or online presentation or something.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Claudia. Anybody else have a comment? I was struck by some of the presentations this morning that really overlap with what we're doing, like the semantics thesaurus for climate change, and how we've been struggling with that for years, and it will be really great. I think we're going to chat this afternoon anyway, Julia, but it would be really great to connect with that, because I think there's possibly some redundancy between what we've been doing. We've probably been doing it really badly, and you've been doing a much better job. But yeah, I think there are loads of places where we could save a lot of resources if we do share what we're doing, and have time perhaps as well to try to get to know what everybody else is doing, because we're often stuck in our own little silos.
Neil, I've got a question for you.
You don't need a microphone.
I don't need the microphone. So the question is, how were you able to cover your time, because this is a practical issue for us, to train people about these techniques that you're using in EVM?
That's a good question. I think many of us work overtime, and that's, I think, exactly the case for everybody here. We love what we do, and we put extra effort in, and I think that's possibly a problem. We now only have 2.5 systematic review experts at SEI because the funding ended and our colleagues have moved over to Formas. And so if the kind of issues like Claudia, where you really wanted to learn those kind of skills, come up, there's going to be less capacity for us to take on those kind of issues. So yeah, the way we've done it at the moment is by having an incredibly flexible project manager who let us take time to do that, for one, but also by taking a hit on some of the other stuff that we're doing. Yeah, Biljana.
Also, just to ask, I mean, just to comment on what you said, Neil, it's also about matter of prioritizing things. Is this very important for us? I think it is, cross-institutional learning, and perhaps maybe we should all think about that when we are thinking, should we have 2 hours and give a BBL, or perhaps, waste 2 hours in a meeting that will not be as productive, I mean, it's also a matter of prioritizing things.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that, because I think that's absolutely right. But even for myself, I find it difficult to know when an opportunity to learn about something comes up. Before I know about it, I don't know if I want it. And so I think that this toolbox idea is nice, because you might be able to go online and find out something about it before, taking it.
So I have a couple of thoughts, really. I think absolutely we need to make sure that we're maximising the usefulness of all of our time. And I think that's something that we really struggle with at the York Centre, and I know everyone else does too. I think it might be particularly acute at York because we're sort of sitting within this university setting, so we have these kind of extra, I guess, a dual masters, basically. We have SEI and the university, so it kind of is problematic for us. But I think that the challenge that I find is, trying where do you get the funding from to support that institutional learning? So what we've done within the Citizen Science Group is we've had 2 Seed Innovation Fund grants from SEI, which have been brilliant because we've specifically built in training other centres in how to use our methods. So we had the citizen science and air pollution project, which we did in with SEI Africa, and that's been really successful because they're now flying with this kind of concept of doing participatory monitoring using citizen science approaches. And then we had another one looking at citizen science and sustainable development goals, where we built in a pilot project with the Asia Centre to do a mini citizen science project. And again, that was really nice because there was funding that was allowing us to work together. So I think kind of being creative in the use of the seed funds and the other kind of core funding mechanisms that are available to us in actually building in methods development and capacity development time in those is one way that we can do that.
Yeah, just on the seed and innovation, I think it is a really good point that I think we need an internal capacity development fund, which then we don't need to be creative. We can have time, we can have resources to share, because otherwise we're just going to waste time learning. And I think having that as a core funded priority is vital. And knowing whether that is a priority for the Research Directorate and for the ED, I think would be a really great feedback. I'm not sure which... Do you have a... Yeah, go.
Yes. So hello, my name is Annie Sturson and I work here in the Stockholm Centre. First, thanks to all the very interesting presentations. It was interesting to get an introduction to different methodologies. And I'm quite new to SCI, but I particularly like the presentation on participatory approaches, because something that I found when I've been thrown in and organizing workshops and so forth is like it seems to be a lot of knowledge across different methodologies about the challenges and lessons learned. How do you organize participation? How do you do it not too complex but meaningful enough? So maybe there's a way of kind of sharing these cross-cutting lessons from different methodologies.
I think it's a good idea to have some sort of resources for training internally, but it's also a matter of using things in projects and spreading them through the work we're actually doing. And because it's not one method that solves everything. When I work in the Scenarios project, for example, we use participatory methods in there as a step in. So it's often a combination of tools, and I think to a large extent it is a matter of tacit knowledge, something that we learn over time, and we need an internal feature to pass that tacit knowledge on, how you combine different methods. What is good for a certain question, what is not good, because the method is not the end in itself. It should be helping you to reach a certain result.
If I can reflect, sorry, just before Karen, on training resources, within Evian we've been really blessed with a project manager who's seen capacity development as a really important thing. So we not only give workshops and university-style long courses in evidence synthesis, we're starting to, but we also have different levels of training materials, whether it's like videos or info briefs or a whole suite of different resources that have different entry points to get you around the methodology. So we spend a lot of time developing different methods and developing different learning resources around those methods. So I think on that, I think it's really important to embrace not only sharing tacit knowledge, but that requires a one-to-one or one-to-many physical interaction. And I think if we can embrace documenting that knowledge and that experience in a way that is then learnable at the user's own pace. And this is why the toolbox, like an online repository of different resources with different amounts of information, I think that, for me, that's the kind of win-win situation, really, where we can learn at our own pace.
Yes, just a comment on what Annie and Kalle said. I think already in the proposal stage, it would be very good if we could find ways of discussing with our colleagues on, I have this research question, what method should I apply and how can we learn from each other? Because when you have the proposal and you get the funding, then it's already set. So I think we can work a lot on already in the beginning when we plan the projects.
I've got a comment on that one. Just if we do that toolbox, a contact person who's prepared to help people think through their proposals could be useful.
I just want to clarify my comment. So I really like the combination actually of prioritizing from above and then us being very innovative of how we are doing these things and how we are fostering the learning. So not only, sorry, my previous comment was probably like prioritizing on the individual basis, but it was actually not about that. It was prioritizing from above. Yeah.
Hello, it's Emma from the York Centre. Part of my role is proposal coordinator, and what I found really interesting is, Laurie, your presentation and the use of that big data, and you talked about Twitter and picking up on hot topics coming up, etc. But actually we could follow our funders and potential funders, and I think really use that in terms of building into our proposal, and I think that would be really exciting.
One thing that we have talked about many times through the history of SEI, last time 3-4 years ago when we organized a workshop in the Rethinking Development theme, was to have some sort of overview library of available methodologies at SEI, and a go-to person for each of those methodologies. So who could I go to, or which people have experience in using these different methodologies? I don't think it would be all that complicated to bring that kind of toolbox view in our new Office 365 system, for example, together.
Oh, so just really quickly, and this links to what was it Julia was saying in the last session about the kind of the terminologies, because then if you could have it so that it linked together, so that you had a sort of participatory approaches people, and then within that you could see these are all the participatory approaches people, and then this is the adaptive management people, and that's actually similar to this concept, they just call it something different, would be really helpful, I think. It goes back to that whole skills database, which again we've talked about SEI for like ages.
Oh, we have one.
So that was good timing. Hi, Sarah. So for those that don't know, I actually assist Åsa Gerger Swartling on the capacity development pillar within SEI. And it's really great to hear this discussion. So one of the activities under that pillar is to try and really improve internal communications on our approaches for capacity building, mostly externally, and kind of what we're learning from those approaches. But sharing tools and approaches is a really big part of that. So I'd be really interested to have deeper conversations with you, Neil, to see how we can link to a toolbox and link that with this communication and knowledge sharing and learning side of it. So our thinking about that is ambitious, but it's still early days, and we're still trying to see kind of exactly what everyone needs so we can deliver that. And obviously, yeah, the Office 365 platform is one way that we're looking to make that happen. And the skills database is something we're still thinking about as well. And yeah, the tagging is exactly how we would do that. We're just still thinking about it. Yeah, thanks for organising this session.
Awesome. So we're nearing the end. Do people have more? Yeah, Laurie.
Just a microscopic remark that perhaps people could, instead of brown bag lunches, make a webinar. I mean, because this would serve other centres. I mean, every time I come to Stockholm, I hear so many exciting things that are so relevant and could be useful for Tallinn office, I'm sure, for Asia office and other offices. So really, I mean, if you do find the time take 2 hours and train and share with the colleagues, why not do it webinar?
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I think one note of caution is that we might find ourselves in a couple of years with a huge number of webinars that don't have a good catalogue. So I think it's really important to learn from the cataloguing, where you can say, like, what level is it, what's the content, who's it suitable for, and having a well-constructed library that has easy entry points. Toby. Oh, you have one behind you.
Yeah, just linking those ideas. I mean, something we've tried in Stockholm is having more speed talks, because people only have a limited amount of time and they're only interested perhaps to know the basics, and then they can dig into it. So given the resounding support for podcasts yesterday, if we just had like 3-minute little podcasts using an iPhone and had a nice simple way of sharing them and organizing them, then it would be very accessible to people. And they could be collated into webinars or whatever as well, but just a repository of those. I think we need to lower the bar for people to understand what's going on and what's what. And half-an-hour presentations is definitely not it, if most of the people are coming cold to that topic.
Really good point. Any more comments? Oh,
Just quickly on that. So we at York we have Wednesday coffee mornings. So somebody brings in cake and we have coffee together. And at those we've started about once a month. We have a speed talk session, and we have 3 people doing 3-minute presentations. And it's actually a really good way of just understanding kind of what your colleagues are doing. And I think Toby's idea of doing them as podcasts is absolutely brilliant. So yeah, we'll get onto that next month. Thanks, Toby.
Åsa.
Thanks a lot, Åsa, SCI Stockholm. I missed the early part of the session, but just hearing this conversation, I think it sounds very interesting, these cataloging, and we can improve how we communicate skills. But ultimately, I think it's very important with the human relationships that we make here during these days. It's much easier to know what a person is doing and is good at in terms of tools and methods if you've met them and you have that face. So this is just, I guess, a plea for everyone who is here, including us in Stockholm, to sort of talk to our colleagues who couldn't come and sort of, who did you meet and what did you learn? And something I will definitely suggest, I think, is to, when we recruit new colleagues, to spread the word across the whole institute. It's hard to keep up, I think, for all of us who are the new people at joining different centers. So that's a very easy part. But just in this conversation, also remember that it's about making these relationships and networking.
A really good point. So if there's no more questions, we've only got 5 minutes to 12 now, so we can have a bonus 5 minutes, I think. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks very much for the speakers. Hopefully this will be an ongoing conversation. There seems to be a lot of interest in prioritizing some form of methodology toolbox, whatever that form is. So maybe we'll take that conversation a little bit higher. Thank you very much, and do reach out and contact any of us whose methods have sparked an interest, and yeah, feel free to talk to us. Thanks.
If you're running out, because we could also just, because what were you going to go through?
There was some assumption behind it, somewhat ignorant as I
I mean, because I was nominated also to participate in the now as an author, but then it was like yeah, no, but then what happened was that the only one who actually got an offer was from 2 months.
Okay. So do you want to? Are you going to go to one of those?
But were you part of the regional assessment? No.
Obviously, we need to lock down some time, but also it would be good to have some time, me, you, and your team.
One particular region? Yeah, of the European
chat a bit about. We should talk briefly before that, as to what is useful to say on the changing situation and options. But I'm conscious of Simon leaves midday Friday.
That was quite a good experience. Apart from the fact that it had really, really short time.
We know when he leaves.
That's the UN system.
Yeah, it's not like a. And then they want to
I think the Finnish ambassador, maybe we can chat to him.
Remind me of all this because I got a phone call the other week from another UN.
It'd be good if me and you could
all your systems
make sure we're talking to them. I think we are, but
I was a bit tempted because I like the report, but I said, well, look, I have several other things. I would probably have had to drop most of them. Having in mind what you're just saying, replacing a lot of pillars,
yeah, you know, it's really, I think it's really important. And I saw also how they structured the people that were sort of the whole European assessment. They are Magilao, Spain, and
I think at that stage I volunteered for something here within our region, but I don't think so very but
yeah, I mean, I think it's a really problem to do that. Because they sort of make it sound as if it's sort of a proper sort of assessment of the identity. It's not. We barely had the time to
emergency thing.
Yeah, pull together the most obvious sources of information. It's really signatures of household waste.
It's again the same story as always. If you can link it up with something you're doing, then there may be value in it. It reminds me that some of my PBL colleagues, they managed to further develop some of their scenarios with the help of UNGO process.
It's really hard for the process to make up their mind if they want that whole process to be a capacity building thing where researchers from everywhere together and we had this meeting. All of us come together to discuss something. It's really hard to outline what the authors are to agree on. So either you sort of make that into sort of capacity, I don't know, something stock taking, or you make a really sharp thing. Where the advertising resources. It seems that they continue to do both. So that we inclusive and everybody is there and
I'm not concerned, I just want to make sure that I'm not doing anything wrong if I write to them. They won't take me out of
to get myself on GitHub. I need to get myself on GitHub and upload some of my very traditional, stereotypical software developer, but the major breakthrough of the morning on the data front is it seems we can get 2015, 2016 and 2017 soy deforestation data from the Sahara. No, from TNC paid for it. They told me they paid for it. I said, we need to know as soon as it's ready. And I found out via some back channel. There's not lack of coordination, but hopefully we can get it. And I'm asking for it by Friday.
Still holding groups.
data? No. This is now funded all from the Moore Foundation, but she's not the gatekeeper. I had to take a call from Tom, so I missed your 5 minutes.
That's good. Very good.
Yeah.
That's very good.
They only had an hour of one.
Oh yeah, because you were on the building.
It was good. I mean, I saw the beginning and the end. I thought it was useful actually. What did Larry talk about big data?
He showed some applications with a cell phone tracking, monitor visitors to read sites very time. But I was chatting with him, but they were trying to hire big data, senior big data, and they failed. They had 2 candidates that were very good at accepted the job. However, happened to the first one, but then the backup also quit his job and said, okay, I'm going to sign a contract. And the next day he said, oh, actually, sorry, my wife doesn't want to work. So they feel 4 months wasted trying to get senior.
He's tried a couple of times. He tried with that guy, Bismarck, with any programming.
So they're going to maybe look for more mid-level.
We should think about that. I don't know what someone we just have someone in Italy. They're quite cheap people in Italy. There's a kind of slave labor perspective. We're a lot cheaper than
Data monkey farm.
Yeah, we could go on the what was the
so I think it was what it could be. So, yeah, I don't think it was a function.
One of the implications from the discussion from Moore and Norway is that they're both keen to fund the rollout of the finance method. And the idea is basically that James could lead on that and kind of ring fence it. But we need to touch base on slightly follow up and understanding back and forth on the name matching that they could do now.
Yeah, he's waiting for Fabio to come back from Brazil. I think he's coming back maybe the second week of May.
Does Fabio work in Python as well?
No, but he can. So it's good for us. Because he was proposing to use the new shiny framework JavaScript. The JavaScript is a mess. Every month you have a new framework that comes out and people say, oh, it's so great, you need to learn it, and it gets abandoned, and it's a really messy ecosystem. And if they can do it in Python, it's good. If they can understand it,
As long as, I mean, Fabio's into, he doesn't work in Python.
Yeah.
Great, okay. Yeah, the best thing is just to look at the screencast James has sent. All I can tell you is, all I've learned is that really. I mean, I've talked to him about plenty of things, but like navigating around the site, there's a hell of a lot more there than we ever paid for or asked. So we've got a few ideas on that, but it's just a useful internal device, I think, at the moment. And it's been incredibly useful to like we are in a very powerful position because they don't know how to do things better. They don't understand it well enough to realise quickly the limitations. They're literally like, wow, this is unbelievable. Which is kind of cool, but like, you're the people that are dispersing tens of millions of dollars. Like, you need to be a little more critical than, wow, this is amazing. Like, that's what I expect my mum to say. But given that you're I only learned this project. I didn't know before. Yeah. So one of the exercises that was listed and how it's been done is for them to come out with a clear typology of the relationship, so we can decide which ones are more useful. Come on, can you put this we could are you running? If we could just chat together over lunch with later as well, just to get some ideas on paper about gender for next week as well. We were going to talk about front end, but actually we should talk about both. The same one.
Vooruit. Ja, we hebben bij hem.
Oké. En dat wat I do.
Ja.
Oké.
Okay. I see you guys, Marcus. Yes, welcome. Oh, you guys are all, yes, we were in a session downstairs playing a game, which was a lot of fun. People got very excited and there were prizes and candy and things. So yeah, I don't know how the session went up here, but I feel the energy in the room. You could say it was not easy to get people to sit down. That's nice. We've come to the end of the Science Forum. And I think I said in the introduction that we've consistently raised the bar on this event. And I think that's true as well this time. It was a bit premature because we hadn't actually done it, but I looked at the program. And I think it's correct to say, actually, that this was the best Science Forum we've had ever. So, one can sense some new directions and some new spirits in the air that we will try to capture and harvest and put in our strategy bag. And then we'll mix it around and then we'll pull out some things and see what comes out. This will be for the next couple of months and towards the end of the year. So, but I'm not going to keep you long here. We're running a bit late. We have several important meetings later on this afternoon and tomorrow. So I want to just say thank you. And I want to say thank you in particular to Nella and Linda here, who has championed this. Please stand up. Please stand up. Stand up. Honestly, it was an amazing job. I cannot think of any single thing could potentially improve on this. Fantastic, fantastic work. I also want to thank Paula and Kimberly, who are you here in the room? Are you still guarding us from the bad people? There is Paula at least, so. And to Ian, of course, who has managed the technology and the webcasting. This is running so well now. Perfect, perfect, perfect. A big chunk of work is to review all the abstracts that come in. So I want to thank the research committee that was doing all the reviewing of all the abstracts and having to make the difficult selection of all the people that have applied. We had to make a selection eventually so we don't get too dispersed and so on. So thank you to the research directorate leaders that were in the committee of the abstracts. Yeah, and thank you, of course, to everybody who prepared abstracts and all of you who have been so active and engaging. I think the spirit of the room has been fantastic. So thank you to SEI. And with that, we're off to lunch here. And then most people are heading back to the office for meetings this afternoon. And there's a party starting at 5:30 or so. There will be it will be fun. I think we have some greetings for our previous director that will be fun to watch. And I think some entertainment will be forthcoming actually. So looking forward to that and see you all there. Bye-bye.